Hello, everyone. I am the narrator, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The first time I saw the fingerprints, I dismissed them as my own. A careless touch while grabbing the orange juice, half asleep by the third morning when I hadn't touched the refrigerator since midnight. I knew something was happening that science couldn't explain. Four distinct fingertips pressed against the inside of the stainless steel door, visible only when the morning light hit at just the right angle. Their edges glowed a sickly phosphorescent blue, outlining what appeared to be numbers 24,478, the exact calories my fitness tracker had recorded the previous day. I'm not a superstitious man. I'm an accountant who deals in certainties, imbalanced ledgers, and reconciled statements. My life runs on the predictable rhythm of numbers that always add up, or at least it did, until my kitchen became ground zero for something that defies explanation, something that's been slowly consuming me, calorie by calculated calorie. The apartment feels different now, colder. The walls seem to expand and contract like lungs when I'm not looking directly at them. The air carries a metallic tang that coats my tongue whenever I approach the kitchen, and always those four fingerprints waiting for me each morning like some cosmic nutritionist keeping score. I first noticed the correlation with my burned calories when I began tracking my workouts more seriously. 3 weeks ago, the numbers changed daily, but always matched my expenditure from the day before. With unsettling precision, a long run yielded higher numbers. A rest day showed lower ones. I took photos recorded. The patterns even measured the fingerprints' dimensions. They were slightly larger than my own hand, about 20% larger. To be precise, I hadn't told anyone yet who would believe me. Last Thursday, I exceeded my usual intake after a client dinner, an indulgent three-course meal with wine and dessert. The application on my phone flashed a warning, 8 to 93 calories over recommended daily intake. I'd never gone that far beyond my limit. Before that night, I dreamed of being watched by something hiding in the darkness of my kitchen, its breath fogging the inside of my refrigerator door. Morning revealed a grotesque transformation. The fingerprints had darkened to a deep violet, almost black at their centers. The glow remained, but pulsed now like a heartbeat, each throb sending waves of nausea through my stomach. As I stood transfixed, a purplish discoloration materialized on my left forearm. Four distinct marks arranged in the exact same pattern as those on the refrigerator. The sensation began as an itch, deepening to a steady throb that quickened and slowed independently of my own pulse. I pressed my fingers against the marks and felt something respond, like touching someone else's wrist and feeling their blood surge beneath your fingertips. But this wasn't my rhythm. It counted in precise increments, each beat seemingly tallying something I called in sick to work. My appetite vanished, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that felt less like hunger and more like something being steadily siphoned away. The bruise-like marks remained for 36 hours before fading, disappearing completely only after I'd maintained a strict caloric deficit for 2 consecutive days. Dr. Reyes, a nutritionist colleague, recommended examine the photographs I'd taken and the patterns I'd documented. The clinical sterility of his office offered temporary relief from the increasing dread that had settled into my home. He adjusted his glasses repeatedly while reviewing my data, his scientific skepticism visibly crumbling as he cross-referenced my food logs with the numerical patterns on my refrigerator. He didn't say the word impossible, but I watched it form and die on his lips several times. Instead, he clinically observed that the sequence of peaks and valleys in the fluorescent outlines resembled an inverted electrocardiogram, a heart beating in perfect opposition to normal human rhythm. When I showed him the fading marks on my arm, his face drained of color. He mumbled something about consulting colleagues before hastily scheduling a follow-up appointment that we both knew would never happen. Later that night, he sent a text declining to continue our consultation, citing ethical boundaries and suggesting I seek more appropriate specialists. The name of a psychiatrist followed desperation, drove me to Home Depot. The next morning, I purchased high-quality appliance paint, determined to cover whatever portal or conduit had formed in my refrigerator. The employee who mixed the exact match to my stainless steel finish avoided eye contact when I explained I needed something that would create an impenetrable barrier, something that would seal completely, something that would keep things in or out. I applied 3 careful coats, watching each layer dry before adding the next. The final result looked flawless, indistinguishable from the factory finish. I slept soundly that night for the first time in weeks, convinced I'd resolved the situation through practical means. The crack woke me at 3:17 a.m., a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake in the darkness of my bedroom. I could smell ozone sharp and electric like the air before a thunderstorm. My forearm throbbed in sympathetic rhythm. Morning revealed the paint fractured in a perfect outline of those 4 fingers, the cracks so precise they might have been etched with a diamond tip tool. The fingerprints had returned deeper now, as though whatever made them was pressing harder, insistent on being acknowledged. The surrounding metal had cooled to a temperature that defied the laws of thermodynamics. So cold it burned my fingers when I touched it, leaving small blisters that mirrored the pattern of the prints as my fingertips made contact with the frigid surface. A voice not audible but somehow directly transmitted into my consciousness whispered the words energy deficit. My knees buckled instantly. I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, a sudden weakness flooding my system as though someone had opened a valve and drained my essential vitality. For several minutes I couldn't move, couldn't even summon the strength to crawl. When I finally managed to pull myself up using the counter, I caught my reflection in the microwave door, my face gaunt, eyes, sunken cheeks, hollow. I looked like I'd lost 10 pounds overnight. The bathroom scale confirmed I was 7 pounds lighter than the previous morning. Impossible, yet the evidence was irrefutable. Something was taken from me, harvesting energy beyond what could be explained by normal metabolism. I began researching obsessively, sleeping only when my body shut down. From exhaustion, I combed through obscure forums where people described supernatural encounters with entities that fed on human energy. Most accounts seemed like obvious fiction, but occasional details aligned so perfectly with my experience that my skin crawled with recognition. One 19th century journal referenced a Lithuanian household entity called a mycnus, a domestic spirit that regulated the family's consumption, punishing waste by extracting life force as compensation. I learned to manage it by adhering to a precise caloric balance, never exceeding what I burned, but also never falling too far below it. Too much surplus and the purple marks would appear, drawing vitality through some unseen connection. Too much deficit and I'd feel a horrible emptiness, a void that seemed to be waiting to be filled with something more essential than food. My life narrowed to this bizarre accounting system. I invested in the most accurate fitness tracker available, weighing every morsel of food, calculating every expenditure of energy with obsessive precision. The fingerprints remained, but as long as I maintained the balance, they stayed a faint phosphorescent blue rather than that threatening violet. I adapted. Humans can adjust to almost anything. I discovered my new normal became this strange symbiosis with whatever monitored me through my refrigerator door. I even developed a grudging appreciation for its mathematical precision. The entity, if that's what it was, never made errors in its calculations. It was a perfect accountant of human energy. Last week, a power outage hit my neighborhood during a storm. Without thinking, I opened the refrigerator to check if the light was out, a ridiculous reflex action. In that brief moment in the beam of my flashlight, I saw something withdraw from the door, a hand pulling back into the depths of the refrigerator. Disappearing among my neatly organized meal prep containers, it moved with the fluid grace of smoke, but had the definite structure of elongated fingers. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted instantly, my breath fogging in the suddenly Arctic air. That night, lying in darkness, I heard something moving in my kitchen. Soft, deliberate sounds of containers being opened, contents assessed, then carefully replaced. The faint glow of blue light seeped under my bedroom door against every instinct for self-preservation. I rose and walked toward it. The refrigerator door stood open, casting that eerie phosphorescent light across my kitchen floor. Inside, my food remained perfectly organized, but somehow altered, as though each item had been sampled in a way that left no visible trace yet diminished its essence. Standing before the open appliance, I felt watched by something just beyond my perception. "What do you want?" I whispered, voice cracking from disuse. I spent so little time speaking these days. The air shimmered between us as the temperature continued to drop. Frost formed on the countertop, spreading in crystalline patterns that mimicked the numerical sequences I documented over weeks. The whisper came again, this time forming words that seemed to bypass my ears and materialize directly in my mind balance. Exchange consumption must equal expenditure. Why me, I asked, though I already suspected the answer. My life before this had been one of excess, thoughtless consumption, wasted food, disregard for the resources I used. All systems seek equilibrium. The refrigerator door swung wider, revealing not the expected interior, but a void, a space that extended far beyond the physical dimensions of the appliance. Within that impossible darkness, something moved with purpose. Approaching the threshold between its realm and mine, I caught glimpses of a form both familiar and utterly alien. A body composed of the same phosphorescent energy that outlined the fingerprints, with limbs that bent at impossible angles, and a face that seemed to be a composite of every hungry creature that ever lived. I didn't run. Where would I go? This thing had already demonstrated its ability to reach across boundaries I had previously thought impermeable. Instead, I stood my ground as it extended its hand, four elongated fingers glowing with that now familiar blue light, and pointed directly at my chest. "Your kind takes without giving, consumes without replenishing. We restore the balance." Understanding bloomed within me. This wasn't about me personally. I was just one data point in a much larger equation, a calculation spanning scales I could barely comprehend. The entity or entities had been here long before. Humans invented refrigerators, measuring the energy flows of living beings, maintaining equilibrium when consumption patterns threatened to destabilize larger systems. The hand retreated, and the refrigerator slowly returned to normal, just an appliance. Once again, though I knew better now, the frost receded, leaving no trace on my countertops. By morning, only the four fingerprints remained as evidence of our exchange. I lived differently. Now I grow what food I can in a small garden, waste nothing, and maintain the precise energy balance my invisible housemate requires. Some nights I wake to find the refrigerator door ajar, a faint blue glow emanating from within, and I no longer feel afraid. Instead, I acknowledge the presence with a respectful nod before returning to bed. The purple marks haven't returned to my arm, though. Sometimes when I'm grocery shopping, I notice other people with similar discolorations peeking out from under their sleeves. I recognize the haunted look in their eyes, the careful way they examine nutrition labels occasionally. Our gazes meet in silent recognition. I've come to believe that what lives in my refrigerator is ancient part of some cosmic regulatory system that long predates humanity. We've simply built convenient portals for these entities with our modern appliances, creating perfect environments for them to monitor our increasingly imbalanced consumption. My refrigerator hums softly as I finish writing this account. The sound has changed subtly over these past months, less mechanical now, more like the contented purr of a well-fed cat. When I open it to prepare my carefully measured dinner, I'll see the fingerprints waiting on the inside of the door, glowing that soft blue that means equilibrium has been maintained, and I'll feel that familiar sensation of being evaluated, assessed, accounted for in some vast ledger that balances energy across systems. I'm only beginning to comprehend the universe I've learned keeps perfect books and payment. One way or another will always come due story. Two, the first time I heard it, my bones knew something was wrong before my mind could process why a perfect whistle, not human, too precise, too sustained, sliced through the evening air at exactly 7:43 p.m. I remember checking my watch reflexively, the hair on my forearms already standing at attention. The sound hung in the air for 17 seconds, neither rising nor falling in pitch, while the numbers on the gas station's price display across the street flickered and plummeted. No one else at the intersection seemed to notice either phenomenon. They just continued driving faces, illuminated by dashboard lights, eyes forward oblivious to the wrongness that had just infiltrated our quiet suburban corner. I've always been a man of routine, finding comfort in predictability. My job as an actuary reinforces this tendency. I calculate risk for a living, converting the chaotic variables of human existence into orderly statistical models. My colleagues joke that I'm more spreadsheet than person. Perhaps they're right. I've never married. Live alone in a meticulously organized condo and drive the same route to work, each day stopping for gas every Monday at the petro station on the corner of Maple and 17th. Nothing about my life invited mystery or supernatural disruption, yet there it was again exactly 1 week later, 7:43 p.m., the otherworldly whistle, the same inexplicable price drop at the petro. This time I pulled over, heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted to escape. I sat still, knuckles white against the steering wheel as the digital display across the street tumbled down to impossible. Numbers 1 by 7 per gallon. Prices hadn't been that low in decades by the time I'd gathered myself enough to consider filling up at this miraculous rate. Both the whistle and the price anomaly had vanished. The station sign showed the normal 479 again, as though nothing had happened that night. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, ceiling fans circling overhead, wondering if stress had finally cracked something essential in my mind. The rational part of me, the part that built statistical models and believed in causality and physics, wanted to dismiss the experiences as hallucinations or coincidences. But something deeper, something primal that lived in my gut rather than my cerebral cortex knew better. It recognized a pattern forming, a disturbance in the natural order that somehow centered on me. The third time I was ready, I positioned my car at the Petetro at 7:40 p.m. engine, idling eyes fixed on both my watch and the price display. My mouth was desert dry and sweat beaded along my hairline. Despite the air conditioning at precisely 7:43, it happened again. The perfect sustained whistle cutting through reality like a scalpel. The prices dropping in digital free fall this time. I acted, jumping out of my car and jamming the nozzle into my tank before rational thought could intervene. The pump registered the impossible price of 0.89 per gallon as fuel flowed into my tank. The whistle stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt thick, almost gelatinous when the tank clicked full. I replaced the nozzle with shaking hands and grabbed my receipt, half expecting it to vanish or burst into flames. It didn't, just ordinary thermal paper with extraordinary numbers printed on it. I slept soundly that night, the first deep sleep I'd had in weeks. When morning came, I convinced myself I'd found the solution, some strange cosmic glitch that required acknowledgement. Nothing more filled the tank when the whistle comes and normally returns a peculiar tax on my sanity. But manageable, this flimsy comfort lasted exactly 7 days. The following Monday, my routine accidentally shifted. A late meeting kept me at the office until 8:15 p.m. By the time I drove past the Petros, it was 8:37, no whistle, no price drop. I felt relief wash over me, thinking perhaps the phenomenon had run its course. I arrived home, microwaved a frozen dinner, and settled in with a documentary about deep sea creatures at precisely 9:43 p.m. The whistle began not outside on the street, but inside my apartment. Inside my head, it penetrated every molecule of air, every cell of my body. I dropped my fork hands, clutching at my ears. Though I somehow knew this would provide no relief, the whistle crescendoed my lungs, constricting as if the sound itself were physical. Drawing oxygen from the room, my vision narrowed to a pinpoint darkness creeping in from the periphery. Just before I lost consciousness, the sound stopped. I woke on my living room floor at 3:17 a.m., the television still playing now, showing an infomercial for kitchen gadgets. My chest ached as though I'd run a marathon when I finally managed to stand, my legs wobbling beneath me like a newborn colt's. I noticed my phone screen lighting up with notifications, 3 missed calls and 7 text messages, all from different neighbors who lived along my commuting route. They all described the same thing. My car had been seen parked outside the Petetro at 7:43 p.m. with what appeared to be me sitting motionless behind the wheel. One neighbor even approached the vehicle, tapping on the window. When I didn't respond to their wave, they described how my silhouette remained rigid, unmoving even when they raised their voice and knocked harder on the glass. Eventually, they gave up and left, disturbed by what they took to be my rudeness, but I hadn't been there. My car had been in the underground parking garage of my building since I'd arrived home. I checked, racing down to the garage in my pajamas. Key fob clutched in my trembling hand, I found my car exactly where I'd left it. The engine was cold, yet when I opened the door, the scent of fresh gasoline assaulted my nostrils. The fuel gauge read full. I hadn't filled up in over a week. Sleep evaded me for the remainder of the night. I called in sick the next day, something I hadn't done in 7 years of employment. Instead of going to work, I drove to the Petro and approached the attendant, a bored-looking young man with acne scars and vacant eyes. When I asked if he remembered seeing me or my car the previous evening, he shrugged and said the security cameras had malfunctioned between 7:30 and 8 p.m. They'd been having electrical issues lately. Sometimes the price display glitched too. He added, though maintenance could never find the problem for the next 2 weeks, I rearranged my entire life to be at that gas station at 7:43 p.m. every day, each time I filled my tank, whether it needed it or not, accumulating a stack of receipts that I kept in a folder labeled Anomaly Documentation. The whistle came precisely on schedule. The prices dropped, and I complied with whatever cosmic directive had entangled me. My credit card bill soared, but the alternative, that suffocating internal whistle, wasn't an option. Then came the day my company announced mandatory overtime to meet a project deadline. I hadn't anticipated this disruption to my new routine as 7:43 approached. I sat trapped in my office 30 floors above street level, sweat drenching my shirt as I stared at the digital clock on my computer screen. 7:42 p.m., my breathing became shallow, my hands trembling as they hovered over my keyboard. I contemplated running, making some excuse to my team, but rational thought reminded me I'd never make it across town in time. 7:43 arrived. I braced myself for the internal whistle, the vacuum-like pressure in my lungs. Nothing happened. Relief flooded through me. Perhaps the entity or phenomenon required geographical proximity to the Petetro. Perhaps I was safe here in my high-rise office, surrounded by fluorescent lights and the mundane paraphernalia of corporate life. When I finally drove home at 9:20 p.m., I passed the Petetro out of habit. The station was closed, unusual for a location that typically operated 24/7. No lights, no customers. Just a dark island of concrete. Under the streetlights, I pulled into my building's garage and sat in my car for a long moment. Exhaustion overtaking anxiety. That's when I noticed the dashboard clock, 7:42 p.m. Impossible. I checked my phone, 9:23 p.m. I tapped the dashboard display, assuming an electronic malfunction. The clock turned to 7:43. The whistle erupted from my glove compartment, accompanied by a rhythmic metallic thumping that pulsed in perfect counterpoint to my own frantic heartbeat. Paralyzed by terror, I watched as the glove compartment door slowly unlatched itself, the plastic cover descending with agonizing deliberation. Inside, illuminated by the dim glow of my dashboard, lights lay a stack of gas receipts I'd never seen before. My credit card number was printed on each one, along with dates from the coming months. May 17th, June, 3rd June, 28th. July 12th, destinations I didn't recognize were handwritten on the backslate. View Cemetery, North Shore Hospital County Morgue, International Airport Terminal B. The whistle intensified the air in the car, growing thin. My lungs burned, vision blurring as oxygen deprivation set in with the last of my strength. I grabbed the receipts and stumbled from the vehicle, collapsing onto the concrete floor of the garage. The car door slammed shut behind me of its own accord in the days that followed. I researched each location listed on the receipts. Lakeview. Cemetery was where my parents had purchased plots decades ago. North Shore Hospital housed the neurological department specializing in brain tumors. The county morgue was self-explanatory and terminal. B service flights primarily to remote locations, places one might go to disappear. I considered destroying the receipts, but something, instinct perhaps, or resignation, stopped me. Instead, I scheduled an immediate medical examination. The doctor found nothing physically wrong but referred me to a neurologist. Given my reported symptoms, the appointment would take place at North Shore Hospital, precisely on the date listed on the second receipt. Today marks 1 week since I found those prophetic receipts. I've established a new routine every evening at 7:43. I'm parked at the Petro filling my tank. Regardless of its level, the whistle comes, the prices drop, and I comply. My bank account dwindles, but my lungs remain full of air. Sometimes in my rearview mirror, I catch glimpses of something that isn't quite my reflection, a shadow self whose movements lag behind mine by fractions of seconds when I turn my head. It's gone. The neighbors no longer report seeing my doppelganger, perhaps because it no longer needs to manifest separately. It's integrated itself into me, or I into it. I've started carrying the future receipts in my wallet, not out of resignation, but strategy, the way I see it. Forewarned is forearmed. If these locations represent inevitable waypoints in my journey, I can either resist and suffocate, or prepare and potentially alter the course. This morning, I noticed something new on the final receipt, the one for the airport. Originally blank on the reverse side, it now bears freshly materialized handwriting coordinates for a location in the remote Alaskan wilderness. Beside it, a single word: escape the whistle will come again tonight. At 7:43, I'll be waiting at the Petro gas cap, open credit card in hand. But this time, I'll have a full tank of questions for whatever entity has colonized my existence. I've calculated the risks, run the statistical models if this phenomenon follows patterns and everything in my actuary. Soul tells me it must. Then there are variables I can manipulate, outcomes I can influence. After all, I deal in probabilities for a living. And the probability that I'll surrender to some predetermined fate without understanding it first is exactly zero. The dashboard clock reads 7:42, 1 minute to go. My heart thunders against my ribs, but my mind is clearer than it's been in weeks. Whatever comes next, whether explanation, escalation, or oblivion, I'll face it with open eyes. Some whistles, I've learned, must be answered. Story 3. I remember the night I first brought that rocking chair home. The air in my living room suddenly felt different, thick and cloying, like it was soaked in stale memories. There was an uncanny stillness that made every nerve in my body scream for me to leave the lights on right from the start. I had the sense that I was not alone. The sensation gnawed at me, an invisible weight on my shoulders, and an uneasy prickling at the back of my neck over time. That initial dread only deepened if I closed my eyes. Now I still feel the damp chill around me, and I hear the subtle creak that sent cold sweat dripping down my spine. I found the chair in what used to be a nursing home on the outskirts of town. The building had been deactivated years earlier. The residents moved to another facility due to rumored health code violations. Curiosity got the better of me one damp afternoon when I passed the locked gates and saw through a broken window several pieces of old furniture. A friend had once mentioned that these abandoned places sometimes held real treasures, antiques that could be restored and sold. I convinced myself this rocking chair could be the key to an easy profit. I remember stepping into the building's foyer, the door hanging crooked on one hinge. My flashlight flickered, revealing corridors lined with peeling wallpaper, an overpowering smell of disinfectant still somehow clinging to the stale air. My footsteps echoed, each step an intrusion. I felt as if the shadows were moving with me in one hallway. I spotted a small room filled with bed frames, boxes of faded personal belongings, and a single rocking chair leaning against the wall. Its wooden frame seemed worn but intact, showing delicate craftsmanship beneath the layers of dust. It had a seat cushion with embroidered patterns of faded flowers. Something about it tugged at my attention, even though it gave me an inexplicable feeling of unease. Despite that gnawing discomfort, I hoisted the chair onto my shoulder and left that decaying building. The entire ride home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something shift in the back seat. The chair simply sat there in silence, reflecting my headlights with dull menace. That first evening, I placed the chair near my fireplace. It looked oddly appropriate there, though. I shivered at the thought of what secrets its wood might hold. Initially, I tried to ignore my apprehension, attributing it to my imagination running wild. but there was a moment around 1:11 a.m. when I woke up to a singular rhythmic creaking. My lungs felt tight, the kind of immediate dread that stops you from sitting up in bed. My heart hammered so fiercely I could feel the pulse in my temples. I was coated in a cold sweat, breathing shallowly as if I had sprinted a mile. Eventually, I forced myself to tiptoe into the living room to check sure enough the rocking chair was swaying gently on its own. The wooden runners sliding over the floor with a faint eerie squeak, a shiver tore through me, and I discovered tiny shards on the carpet. Thin curved fragments I later recognized as human fingernail clippings. There were only a few at first scattered in a pattern I couldn't decipher. I scooped them up with trembling hands, my stomach rowing. I tried to calm myself, telling no one in particular that it had to be some elaborate prank or leftover debris from the old nursing home. The smell of the nails was rancid, making me gag, though I couldn't fathom how decades-old clippings still carried such a pungent odor. The next morning, after an anxious, near-sleepless night, I found more of those fragments arranged in a crude message across the carpet. They spelled out a single word in Portuguese Santa, which means sit. My initial terror twisted into disbelief. I couldn't understand how in the world that arrangement had formed, let alone why no one else had a key to my house. I checked all the windows, all the doors, but there was no sign of forced entry for days. I tried to dismiss what had happened as some delusion. I vacuumed the carpet, wiped down the rocking chair, and tried to resume a normal routine, yet the same hour always 1:11 a.m. I would hear it, a slow, maddening creak near the fireplace. My breathing would grow shallow, my heartbeat pounding, and my mouth turn dry with each iteration of that sound. Some nights I could almost feel a presence seated on that chair, like a faint displacement of air. I began to avoid the living room after dark, confining myself to the bedroom, telling myself I was simply tired and overworked. Eventually, my curiosity won out. One Sunday, I decided to surrender to the demands scrolled out on my carpet in those grotesque clippings. I sat in the chair, letting its wooden arms cradle me. At first, there was silence, just my ragged breathing and the ringing in my ears. Then it started rocking, not gently, but with a force that made the wood groan. My back pressed tight against the seat, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the armrests. My heart thumped in panicked surges, each beat a thunderous explosion in my chest. I felt pinned down by something intangible and relentless. In that moment, I swear I saw corridors that weren't my own. They smelled of disinfectant and stale food. The overhead lights flickered, illuminating faded murals of pastel colors. I heard distant coughing, the scrape of a walker on the floor, and the murmured laments of someone unseen. I sensed the desperation of frail hands pressing a call button. My pulse raced, my skin clammy and cold. A wave of dizziness crashed into me, and the sounds grew louder, blending into a crescendo of discomfort and pleading. I shot out of the chair the moment I could muster the will. My legs were wobbly, and I stumbled onto the floor, panting like I just fought my way up 1,000 steps. The room reeled around me, shapes and shadows stretching in unnatural ways. After a moment of disorientation, I scrambled away, bumping into furniture, nearly tripping over the coffee table. I had never felt such a stark sense of displacement. It was as though I had left my body and roamed the halls of that decrepit nursing home, experiencing memories that weren't mine from that day forward. The floor around the chair developed strange streak marks, as if the chair's runners had grown wheels that traced small circles into the hardwood. I tried to clean the scuffs, but each morning I found more intricate markings, forming a labyrinthine pattern that spiraled toward the exact center of my living room. I felt ill at ease. Every time I looked at those lines, they seemed to lead me to the chair. No matter where I stood, in a desperate bid to rid myself of this bizarre presence. I attempted to sell the chair online. I took photographs, wrote a polite description, and posted the listing, but each time my ad vanished within minutes, replaced by a pop-up in blinking letters: Vaga permanente, reserve. Another Portuguese phrase, this one meaning permanent vacancy reserved. I tried alternative sites, even social media marketplace groups, but the same phenomenon occurred soon. I stopped trying because every new pop-up left me feeling more and more vulnerable, as though I was somehow being watched through my screen. I told a coworker about the situation in a vague, indirect way. He thought I was joking or craving attention when I tried to explain that I might be dealing with something supernatural. He simply changed the subject. Focusing on a work project, I got the sense that no one would truly believe me. Even I didn't fully trust my own perception. I developed a stress-induced tic blinking rapidly whenever I was forced to talk about that chair. My nights turned into sweaty vigils. I'd lie in bed counting the minutes until 1:11 a.m. If I tried to sleep earlier, I'd dream of those endless corridors and the phantom squeaking of a rocking chair echoing in a distant hallway. The stench of disinfectant invaded my senses, and I'd wake up choking, drenched in cold sweat with my heart hammering. I began to question whether I was losing my mind or falling prey to a possession of some twisted artifact. The more I avoided the living room, the more it felt like that space was shrinking, being consumed by the presence of the rocking chair. I saw it in my peripheral vision. At all times, that black shape near the fireplace, the labyrinth on the floor, was becoming more detailed by the day circles overlapped in elaborate patterns, reminiscent of Celtic knots all converging on the chair's position. When I ran my fingertips over these etched lines, they felt deeper than mere surface scratches, almost like scars cut into the wood. I decided to move the chair to the garage one evening, hoping that removing it from the house proper would lessen its hold. My palms were sweaty as I gripped its arms. My heart rattled inside my chest when I dragged the chair across the threshold. The moment its wheels left those engraved circles, I felt a pressure in my skull, a suffocating headache that stabbed behind my eyes. The air felt charged like the electricity in the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I fought the dizziness long enough to push the chair into a corner of the garage and slam the door shut behind me. That night was the first in a long while when I didn't hear the squeaking at exactly 1:11 a.m. Instead, I heard a steady, insistent tapping in the garage. Unable to sleep, I walked carefully down the hallway, each footstep somehow amplified by my own dread. At the garage door, I pressed my ear against the cold metal. The tapping pulsed in sync with my heartbeat, an ominous countdown. My breathing became erratic, and there was a quiver in my knees as I imagined opening that door, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I slunk back to bed more exhausted than ever. In the morning, I found the door to the garage wide open, despite my certainty that I'd locked it. The rocking chair was back in my living room, precisely where it had sat before. The labyrinth lines had extended further, weaving around the chair as if welcoming it home. My stomach flipped, and I felt a sheen of sweat on my forehead. I wanted to retch as a wave of panic coursed through me. It became painfully clear that no matter what I tried, the chair would remain steadfast and unmoving, as though it belonged in that spot more than I did. My anxiety swelled into full-blown paranoia. I started to see fleeting shapes in the corners of my vision. Each day at work, I was unable to concentrate, certain that I was being followed by a malignant presence. Simple sounds, a door creaking. A coworker dropping a pen made me flinch and break out in goosebumps. I kept swallowing the lump in my throat, my tongue chalky and my hands trembling with a cold, jittery energy. No matter how many times I splashed water on my face, the tension refused to subside. One night, as I hovered at the living room entrance, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. The chair was rocking again, back and forth, with no one in it. The floor around it glowed faintly, the scuffs reflecting the moonlight in a slick, almost oily sheen. I noticed new nail fragments scattered around, forming twisted shapes I couldn't decipher. My vision swam, and I felt an intense pull, as if the chair were beckoning me to sit once more. The next few minutes are still a blur in my memory. I recall slowly approaching the chair legs, quivering with the aftershock of adrenaline. The wood gave off a faint scent, an unsettling mix of decaying polish and something metallic. Yet I felt this bizarre compulsion to lower myself into the seat. Every step closer caused my heartbeat to thunder in my ears, my breath hitching in my chest. By the time I was inches away, I realized I was sweating profusely, my shirt clinging to my back the instant I made contact with the seat. My vision swirled, the living room walls peeled away, replaced by that same corridor from my earlier vision. I smelled the pungent disinfectant and heard the squeak of an IV stand rolling along a linoleum floor. The overhead lights buzzed and flickered. My mind reeled as I felt the despair of unspoken years pressing in on me. Seniors calling for help, the hush of staff ignoring unanswered bells, the faint sob of someone left too long in a wheelchair. The sorrow was suffocating my breathing. Hitched, and I let out a shaky exhale, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. It was not my memory yet. It gripped me as tightly as if I had lived it all. When I surfaced back into my living room, I stumbled off the chair, panting heavily. My heart felt like it would burst from my rib cage. There was an agonizing ache in my chest, a dread that sank into the marrow of my bones. I curled up against the wall, pressing my hands to my ears, desperate to shut out the echo of moaning voices I could still hear in my mind. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the persistent trembling in my legs refusing to subside. Some small measure of resolve crept back into me. I had to stop pretending this was going to resolve itself. I couldn't sell. It couldn't move it, and certainly couldn't destroy it without risking an even more horrendous backlash. I knew I had to confront it directly, even if it meant stepping into the corridors of someone else's nightmares again. I rose shakily and steeled myself. Instead of fleeing my home, I stayed night after night. I waited. The rocking chair continued its routine, mocking me with that incessant squeak. My nights became a series of half sleeps and jolting awakenings. Yet every time I considered sitting down again, my courage faltered. My mind returned to those uncanny experiences, and I felt my heart seize with panic. Then yesterday something changed. I noticed new letters traced out by the nail fragments, this time in English. No escape. The reflection of those words on the polished floor filled me with such dread that my tongue felt too thick in my mouth, and I gulped down air to steady myself. Even now, each breath seems laced with fear. I don't want to leave my house for good, nor do I want to stay. It feels as though the chair and I are locked in a silent battle. I exist in a perpetual state of unease, never fully awake, never peacefully asleep. The labyrinth marks remain, and now they extend to the hallway, inching toward my bedroom, creeping closer as though to envelop every square inch of this place I once considered my sanctuary. My final decision is this. I cannot destroy the rocking chair, but I can keep it under watch. I will stay in my living room tonight. Lights on, refusing to let it dictate my fear if it tries to impose another vision on me. I'll face it. I have no grand illusions of victory, but I won't be driven out of my own home. A trembling calm settles over me as I write this. Though my heartbeat still pounds erratically, I can almost sense the chair's influence intensifying. The room feels too thick, the air oppressive, as if pregnant with malevolent anticipation. I don't know what will happen next. Perhaps I'll stand my ground and learn to live with the labyrinth's ceaseless expansion, or maybe the rocking chair's pull will become too overwhelming and my mind will fracture under the constant barrage of borrowed memories. But I'm not running, at least not yet. My only hope is that by facing it head on, I'll break whatever cycle has tied me to that relic of loneliness and despair. As I finish these words, I cast one last glance at the chair. Even though it's still, I hear the faint echo of its creak deep within my thoughts. There's a certainty in my gut that the confrontation is far from over. My palms are damp and my breath catches every few seconds, but I remain in place. If there is any resolution to be had, it will come from staring this darkness in the face, not fleeing from it. And so the final image as I close my eyes is the chair silent yet thrumming with unseen energies, a silent invitation to madness. The house grows colder, the marks on the floor ripple as I blink, and still I wait somewhere beyond the edges of perception. I sense a presence neither living nor dead claiming its seat. I can feel the weight on my own chest, the creeping tingle up my spine, reminding me that I've bound myself to this presence willingly or not. The squeak begins again, slow and deliberate like a heartbeat in the darkness story. For the house whispered to me from the moment I signed the deed. Not with words, God, how I wish it had been merely words, but through a language of subtle wrongness that my rational mind dismissed, the way shadows seemed to linger too long in corners, how the floorboards creaked in sequence when I knew I was alone. the persistent copper taste that lingered in my morning coffee. Despite changing brands 3 times, I should have recognized these warning signs, these small crimson flags unfurling in my peripheral vision. By the time I understood what dwelled beneath my home, it had already begun considering me as part of its territory. I purchased the single-story Victorian last October, a foreclosure and a steal. At that price, my realtor had emphasized with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The property sat on nearly 2 acres of overgrown land at the edge of town, backing up to a stretch of woods that had somehow escaped development. The previous owners had vanished without explanation, leaving behind furniture draped in sheets like pale ghosts, frozen in silent tableau. The neighbors offered vague, uncomfortable responses when I asked about them. A family emergency, a sudden job transfer, their stories never quite aligned, but I was too enchanted by the intricate crown molding and the original hardwood floors to care. The first month passed without incident as I settled in unpacking boxes and making minor renovations. I painted over the peculiar rust-cold stains in the basement that even industrial cleaner couldn't remove. I replaced the kitchen fixtures that ran brackish water for several minutes before clearing. I convinced myself the occasional scratching sounds in the walls were just rodents that would soon succumb to the traps I'd set. It was on a Tuesday evening while taking out trash that I first noticed it. A flash of movement in my peripheral vision, a streak of crimson that disappeared the moment I turned to look directly at it. I dismissed it as a trick of the setting sun against the fence, perhaps reflecting off a piece of metal or glass. But when it happened again the following night, and then again 3 days later, always visible only from the corner of my eye, I began to grow uneasy. The color wasn't quite red, more like the deep viscous crimson of arterial blood with an unnatural luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. It moved with purpose along the perimeter of my yard, always keeping to the edges, always vanishing when I tried to look at it. Head on, I began to dread dusk when the fading light seemed to strengthen whatever phantom patrolled my property. Sleep became increasingly difficult as November dragged on. I would jolt awake at exactly 3:17 a.m., my body drenched in cold sweat. Despite the heat cranked to 72 degrees in those disorienting moments between sleep and wakefulness, I could swear I felt a rhythmic vibration through my mattress, a dull, persistent thudding that seemed to emanate from deep beneath the house. Thump, 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 like a massive heart beating in slow motion under the floorboards. I told myself it was the furnace cycling on, or water in the old pipes, or any number of rational explanations that didn't involve admitting what my instincts were. Increasingly screaming, something was wrong with this house, something fundamental and impossible. By December, I had begun recording the phenomena in a journal, attempting to apply logic to the inexplicable. The crimson streak appeared most frequently on cloudless nights. The thudding beneath the house intensified after rainfall, and most disturbingly, I had begun to notice a correlation between my emotional state and the intensity of the occurrences when I was anxious or angry. The manifestations grew stronger. The neighbors avoided me now when I forced an encounter with Mrs. Keller from across the street to ask if she'd ever experienced anything unusual in her home. She clutched her cross necklace and mumbled something about the land having peculiarities before hurrying inside. The postal carrier no longer came to my door, but instead left packages at the end of the driveway. Even my friends made excuses not to visit, claiming the house gave them headaches or a vague sense of nausea. I was becoming isolated, which I now realize was exactly what it wanted. The incident that forced me to acknowledge the true horror of my situation occurred on the winter solstice. The longest night of the year, I had fallen asleep on the couch after taking a double dose of sleeping pills to quiet the now constant hooting beneath the house. I awoke to a profound silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been, the absence of sound pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. The digital clock on the cable box read 3:17 a.m. Something compelled me to go outside, not curiosity. I was well beyond curiosity now, but a pulling sensation as if a hook had been planted in my solar plexus and was gently but insistently drawing me toward the back door. My limbs moved as if through molasses. Heavy and uncoordinated, my breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air of my living room. I found myself standing on my back porch without a clear memory of how I'd gotten there. The night was painfully clear, stars hard and bright as diamond shards against the black void of space. The ground was covered in frost, despite the weather forecast having predicted temperatures in the 40s, and there at the far edge of my property stood a figure. My first coherent thought was that someone had broken in, a squatter perhaps, or a vagrant seeking shelter in the woods beyond my property line. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized what I was seeing wasn't human. Despite its humanoid shape, it stood perfectly still, a silhouette cut from the fabric of night that somehow managed to be darker than the darkness surrounding it, except for its edges, which pulsed with that same crimson luminescence I'd been catching glimpses of for weeks. And its eyes, God. Its eyes, they glowed with such intensity that looking into them was like staring into the heart of a blast furnace. Not red, but a color. I have no name for a hue that exists somewhere beyond the spectrum. Visible to human perception, my brain interpreted it as a blinding white tinged with crimson, but I knew instinctively that wasn't accurate. It was a color that had no business existing in our reality. We regarded each other across the expanse of my frost-covered yard. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body temperature plummeted so rapidly that I felt ice crystals forming in my lungs with each shallow gasp. Paradoxically, the air around the figure seemed to shimmer with heat, distorting its outline like asphalt on a summer day. A name formed in my mind not through hearing or sight, but as if it had always been there, written on the inside of my skull in letters I was only now learning to read Vonicus. The knowledge came with absolute certainty, despite having no idea what it meant or how I knew it. The creature Venicus tilted its head slightly, a gesture so human it sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. Its mouth opened, revealing a cavity of pulsing crimson light. No sound emerged, but I felt rather than heard a single word reverberate through my consciousness mine. Then it was gone, not in the sense of running away or fading gradually, but simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next. The only evidence it had been there at all was the lingering scent of iron like freshly spilled blood, and a perfect circle of dead grass where it had stood frost melted away to reveal blackened earth beneath. I retreated inside, locking the door with trembling hands, knowing even as I did so how futile the gesture was against something that could apparently materialize and dematerialize at will. I spent the remainder of that endless night huddled in my bathroom, the only room in the house with no windows, a kitchen knife clutched in white. Knuckled hands as I listened to the house settle around me with sounds no structure made of wood, and nails should make morning brought no relief. Only a grim determination born of desperation. I needed answers the local library yielded nothing about the history of my property. Beyond mundane records of ownership transfers and tax assessments, the Historical Society was equally unhelpful, though the ancient volunteer who assisted me gave me such a pitying look when I mentioned my address that I nearly broke down and told her everything it was at the county clerk's office that I finally discovered a clue while searching through microfiche. Records of old newspapers, I found a small article from 1897 describing a peculiar geological anomaly discovered during the initial construction of my home. Workers had uncovered what was described as a cavity of unusual composition and temperature approximately 20 feet beneath what would become the house's foundation. The project was briefly halted while experts from a nearby university examined the find, but construction eventually resumed with no further explanation. That night, the Crimson Shadows returned with a vengeance. They no longer confined themselves to the yard, but danced across my walls, pulsing in perfect synchronization with the thooting beneath the house. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing one moment, sweltering the next. The iron smell grew so overpowering that I gagged, yet somehow I knew it wasn't blood I was smelling, but something far older and more fundamental in my desperation. I contacted a professor of geology from the article now. Long retired Dr. Harrison initially refused to speak with me, but when I described what I'd been experiencing, his demeanor changed from irritation to what I can only describe as controlled panic. He agreed to meet me at a diner 40 miles away from my house. Insisting on the distance, the elderly man who greeted me bore little resemblance to the distinguished academic I'd researched online. His hands shook constantly and his eyes darted around the restaurant as if expecting to be ambushed. He spoke in hushed tones about what they'd found beneath my house. Over 70 years ago, a perfectly spherical chamber that maintained a constant temperature of 98.6 degrees. 6 degrees regardless of external conditions, the walls of this chamber pulsed rhythmically every 72 seconds and were composed of a material that defied conventional analysis, organic but not biological, with properties of both liquid and solid states. We should never have sealed it back up, he whispered, his coffee untouched before him. Something that old, that alien to our understanding. It doesn't sleep forever. When I asked what he thought it was, his expression crumpled into something between fear and resignation. He didn't believe it was a natural formation or anything that evolved on Earth. His theory, the one that had ended his academic career and relegated him to the fringes of his field, was that the chamber was cardiovascular in nature, a heart, a heart belonging to something incomprehensibly ancient that had been dormant until our intrusion disturbed it, and now it's awake. I said the words hanging between us like a death sentence. He nodded grimly. It's establishing a territory, marking boundaries in you. He looked at me with genuine pity. You're living directly above its primary organ. It knows you're there. It's becoming aware of you the way you might gradually notice a persistent itch or a splinter under your skin. I asked him how to stop it, how to drive it away or destroy it. His bitter laugh drew stares from nearby diners. Destroy it, you might as well try to destroy a mountain or drain an ocean with a teaspoon. The best you can hope for is to appease it or escape its notice. I left our meeting with a list of bizarre precautions and rituals, some scientific, others veering into the realm of superstition and occult practices that the professor had collected from various sources over decades: salt barriers, iron filings, complex patterns of sound that might disrupt its biorhythms, offerings of raw meat left at property boundaries to satisfy hungers. We couldn't comprehend. Some of these measures seemed to help. Temporarily, the thudding would quiet for hours after I played specific frequencies through speakers placed directly on the floor. The crimson manifestations retreated when I lined thresholds with mixtures of salt and iron, but each time they returned stronger, as if the entity were learning, adapting to my defenses. I haven't slept in my bedroom for weeks now. The thudding is constant there, the walls pulsing visibly in time with the rhythm I've taken to sleeping in my car. Some nights parked at the far edge of my property where the influence seems weakest, but even there I wake to find tendrils of crimson light probing the vehicle seeking entry. I'm writing this from a motel 30 meters away, but I can still feel it. The connection goes both ways now. When I close my eyes, I can sense the enormous presence beneath my house, feel the slow, deliberate thoughts of something processing reality through a consciousness utterly alien to human experience. It's curious about me. It finds my fear interesting. I've listed the house for sale, but I already know no one will buy it. The property is marked, now changed in ways invisible to the eye but unmistakable to the deeper senses we all possess, but rarely acknowledge. I'm not sure I could even go through with selling it to some unsuspecting family, knowing what waits beneath the foundation. Sometimes I wonder if escape is even possible. Last night, I dreamt I was back in the house, standing at the center of my living room. As the floor beneath me became transparent, I could see it then. The massive pulsing organ that is neither flesh nor stone, extending tendrils throughout the surrounding soil like roots or veins. In the dream, I watched as one of those tendrils emerged from my own chest, connecting us in a horrific symbiosis. I woke clutching at my chest, convinced I would find an entry wound. Some evidence of physical penetration. There was nothing visible, but the certainty remains. It has marked me just as it has marked the land. I am becoming a part of its territory, its ecosystem. Not prey exactly, but not a separate entity either. I don't know how this ends. I only know I can't go back to that house yet. I feel its pull even now, a persistent tugging sensation drawing me back toward what feels increasingly like home. The truly terrifying realization is not that something ancient and unknowable has invaded my house, but that I might be evolving into something that belongs there with it, in the pulsing crimson darkness beneath the foundation of what was once my sanctuary. But I will resist for now. At least I am still human enough to recognize the horror of what awaits me. There I am still myself enough to run, to hide, to fight against the crimson pulse that beats in synchronization with my own heart. God help me, I can hear it even now. Thump, 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 growing closer with each beat story. 5. I remember the first time I realized something was wrong, and it wasn't just the fading light bulb overhead or the creaking floorboards that reverberated long after I stood still. It was the hush in the corridor, too quiet, like the very air was holding its breath. Even before I started my nighttime tinkering, my pulse would pick up speed as soon as I stepped into that hallway, as though I were trespassing on a territory not meant for me. The gloom seemed thicker there, and every so often I thought I heard a faint scraping sound like fingernails on concrete. My skin would prickle the hair on my arms standing upright. In those moments, I fought the urge to turn back to my room and lock the door instead. I'd grit my teeth, take a couple of shaky breaths, and keep going. My project, an intricate scale model of a futuristic spacecraft, was supposed to distract me from stress. There was something oddly soothing about arranging tiny plastic pieces into a greater whole, following a blueprint of fine, precise lines. Yet from the start, one particular piece, a small wedge-shaped block, refused to cooperate. I'm not sure how to describe it, but it always seemed to slip from my fingers. At the worst times, it would fall silently onto the desk, then roll across it in a mocking dance. Continuing onto the floor, I'd scramble after it, crawling under furniture only to find it resting a few inches from the corridor leading out of my workshop. I tried ignoring the sense of unease creeping up my spine. Whenever that piece escaped from my hands, it felt like it wanted to be somewhere else late one night. While the house was dark and silent, I heard a loud tap against the wall. My heart lurched with each step through the hallway. My breath grew shallow, and the sweat on my palms made my flashlight slippery. I found that same wedge piece on the floor right at the threshold of the corridor, as though it had been thrown with some velocity from within the dark. I picked it up, my hand trembling, and placed it back on the desk. That was when I noticed the time, 2 a.m. Exactly, I didn't read too much into it initially, but I did feel an unwelcome flutter in my stomach. Still, I went to bed hoping the next day would be less unsettling. Over the following days, I continued working on the model. The wedge piece stayed where it was supposed to, at least until I was nearly finished assembling the entire craft. I had the hull, the wings, the tiny propulsion units, all placed with delicate care. Then at about 2 a.m., one night I heard another distinct noise from the corridor, a whoosh followed by a dull thud. When I ventured out, my senses were on high alert. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting in the dim glow of my flashlight. My chest felt constricted as though my ribs were in a vice. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, each pulse a warning to retreat. But I stepped forward anyway. Suddenly something small and hard struck my shoulder. A jolt of pain radiated down my arm, forcing me to drop the flashlight. It clattered on the floor, casting wild circles of light around the corridor walls when I retrieved it. My breath ragged, I realized the projectile was the very wedge piece I'd inserted into the model. Earlier that evening, it had been launched at me from deep in the house. The digital watch on my wrist blinked 2 ocks. My mouth went dry, and I had to choke back a startled cry. The hallway seemed to lengthen right before my eyes, stretching out like a tunnel that might never end. I retreated to the workshop, holding the wedge piece as though it might burst into flame in my hand. That was when I made a grim discovery. Every 3 hours exactly at World Air 5811.
And so on the piece was repeating its trajectory. If I put it back into the model, it would vanish without explanation, only to reappear on cue, flying aggressively at me. My entire body would tense each time, heart hammering like a drum in my chest. The anxiety built steadily, spreading cold sweat across my forehead and down my back. I set up cameras around the workshop in the corridor, hoping to catch the piece in action. But each time I reviewed the footage, all I would see was a blur, a quick flicker, and then the piece would be gone. At first, I tried to deny the sense of dread gnawing at my gut, but by the third day, exhaustion was overwhelming me. I was terrified of being in that corridor alone at night. The floorboards would squeak behind me even when I stood still, and I was beginning to hear faint mechanical sounds like grinding gears in the distance, even though there was no machinery in that part of the house. My nights became restless. I could feel the pounding of my heart deep in my ears, sometimes so intense it drowned out the faint hum of the air conditioner, and always I jolt awake at the top of each 3-hour mark, expecting another impact. Eventually, I decided to confront it. I figured if the wedge piece was determined to break free, I should try fitting it back one final time in precisely the right spot, with heavy glue or maybe some extra bonding method. So just after midnight, I rose from my makeshift bed in the workshop. My limbs felt shaky, weighed down by days of poor sleep. The model rested on the desk, looking perfectly normal, aside from the missing wedge that was now in my hand, radiating a chill I could almost feel through the plastic. With careful, trembling fingers, I applied an industrial-strength adhesive along its edges and slotted it back into the main body of the spacecraft for a few minutes. Nothing happened. I stood there waiting while my breathing made the only sound in the room. Then an ominous vibration coursed through the model. One by one, the other pieces, parts of the fuselage wings, tiny decorative thrusters began popping off, as if repelled by a powerful force at the model's core. They didn't just scatter across the desk, they swirled in the air around that stubborn wedge piece, rotating like satellites caught in orbit. My throat felt constricted, and my scalp tingled with an electrifying terror. 1,000 urgent thoughts clawed at my brain. This isn't possible. I must be hallucinating yet. There it was right in front of me, an entire miniature spacecraft, disassembling on its own. The pieces spinning in the air, clacking into one another with mechanical precision. They formed a peculiar arrow shape, pointing toward the attic door. I had never ventured up into the attic at such a late hour, and even during the day it was a cramped, dusty place that made me claustrophobic. But when I saw that swirling arrow of plastic parts, I couldn't ignore the horrifying invitation. My heart hammered so forcefully in my chest that each beat sent a tremor down my arms. My legs felt like lead. As I slowly climbed the narrow steps, the attic was even darker than the corridor, and the air had a stale, suffocating taste. I sensed movement in the corners, though the flashlight beam revealed nothing but cobweb-covered boxes. A sharp hiss echoed in the rafters, followed by a low grinding noise like distant machinery. I could hear my pulse as a steady roar in my ears, my breathing rapid and shallow. When I reached the center of the attic, I realized I was not alone in one corner. Partially hidden behind ancient furniture stood a massive version of that wedge piece. It looked like a giant block of plastic scaled up to the size of a small car. My flashlight flickered, as if the energy in the room was fluctuating. Each flicker revealed the wedge pulsing with a dim reddish glow, almost like a plastic heart. I approached it, drawn by an odd compulsion that overrode all my instinctual fears. Standing before that grotesque, pulsating object, my skin prickled with waves of dread. The smell in the attic changed, turning vaguely metallic, reminding me of overheated wiring. My stomach churned, my temples throbbed, and my fingers shook around the flashlight handle. My entire body screamed for me to leave, but I had to know. I had to put a hand on that thing and prove to myself it was real. When my fingertips finally touched its surface, a surge of cold electricity rushed through my arm. I gasped in pain and nearly collapsed. A moment later, I heard an impossible chorus of grinding gears inside my own head. In that moment of contact, the piece felt both rigid and alive, throbbing against my palm like a heartbeat. My back arched and a white-hot pulse of agony tore through my spine. It was as though something had plucked out one of my vertebrae and replaced it with a chunk of plastic. I knew how absurd that sounded, yet I felt a sharp absence in my body, accompanied by a deep, unnatural pressure, right where my vertebrae should have been. My knees buckled, and I sank to the attic floor, panting. The wooden boards felt damp with my sweat, and I could smell the sharp tang of my own fear. I tried to compose myself, but my muscles trembled uncontrollably. My vision swam with shadows dancing along the edges, the wedge piece now silent, gradually dimmed until it no longer glowed. I tested my back by twisting slightly. It ached, and I realized I couldn't bend the way I used to. There was a stiffness there, like a mechanical pivot. This is insane, I thought, pressing a hand to my throbbing forehead. My breath came in shallow bursts, each exhalation stinging my dry lips. My entire body tingled with pins and needles, as if I'd been electrocuted slowly as my vision cleared. I realized the giant wedge wasn't the only thing in the attic. Scattered around it were bits and pieces of who knows what old hardware, chunks of plastic, even twisted bits of metal that looked melted together. Some seemed fused, forming an almost biological cluster like mechanical organs. It was a grotesque patchwork, each piece welded or glued to another by some unknown process. I retreated a few steps, then forced myself to stand. The oppressive silence was suffocating. The beam of my flashlight was weak now, the battery draining too quickly for comfort. My mind buzzed with an otherworldly hum, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was the wedge piece resonating inside me. My back twinged painfully with each breath. On an impulse, I tried to speak out loud, to demand answers from whatever force was at work, but all that emerged was a hoarse rasp. Even my voice seemed stolen by the tension staggering toward the attic steps. I half expected the enormous wedge to leap at me, or send some supernatural shock through the air, but it remained dormant, looming in the corner, half illuminated by the fading flashlight. I couldn't ignore the swirling sense of dread that told me this thing wasn't finished with me yet. As I descended each step, groaned dangerously under my unsteady weight. My mind raced. I pictured that wedge now lodged in my spine, functioning as a surrogate vertebra. The idea alone made me want to retch. My stomach turned, and cold sweat beaded at my temples back in the corridor. I realized it was 5 a.m. Another 3-hour interval had just passed. My arms trembled so badly I struggled to keep the flashlight steady. My mouth was dry as sandpaper, and each gulp felt like swallowing razor blades. I braced myself for the wedge piece to shoot out of the darkness again, but instead the house fell into an unnerving stillness. Only my labored breathing and the faint hum of an appliance somewhere broke the silence. An unrelenting paranoia had settled over me, urging that every shadow flickering along the walls might hide something malignant. For days afterward, I tried to go about my routines, but my sense of reality was fraying. Whenever I needed to bend my back, I'd feel the sharp stiffness where that wedge must have been fused into my spine. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced the wedge was glowing through my skin. The corridor outside my room felt more claustrophobic than ever, as though the walls had inched closer. I jumped at every sound, every flicker of the overhead light. My reflection in the mirror became unsettling. My posture suddenly altered my spine, curving in an odd way. A few acquaintances noticed me grimacing with each step. Someone tried asking if I'd been injured, but I only shook my head, stammering some excuse about my back giving me trouble. I couldn't face explaining what had really happened up in that attic. I certainly couldn't show them the large wedge piece that pulsed like a heart in half. Whispered fragments, I relayed a sanitized version of the events to a close friend, but my words sounded ridiculous even to my own ears. He looked concerned, then confused, and I changed the subject quickly to avoid further scrutiny in the evenings. The workshop became a place of dread rather than comfort. The leftover pieces from the model were strewn about, some of them warped as if partially melted. The memory of them spinning in the air like planets around a tiny star forced my pulse to quicken. Sometimes I thought I could still see them move out of the corner of my eye. I'd catch a glimpse of a small wing twitching or a panel trembling. My imagination ran wild with images of those parts reassembling themselves into some new shape. Maybe a shape I wouldn't recognize, maybe something monstrous. The corridor seemed alive, expanding and contracting in sync with my anxious heartbeat. Every few hours I braced for the wedge to appear again, but it stayed silent instead. I felt its presence internally, a foreign block lodged within me. I imagined it was growing, or maybe merging with my vertebrae. My spine would click and groan when I twisted too far. Sleep became a distant memory. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and my skin felt perpetually clammy. I heard phantom gears grinding at the edges of my hearing, an incessant mechanical churn. I couldn't stand it any longer.
Something inside me snapped a burst of desperation, overriding the fear. I returned to the attic during daylight, throwing open the hatch to let in what little sun could penetrate the dusty space. My back throbbed with each rung of the ladder, but I forced myself forward. Ignoring the sweat that dripped down my temples, when I reached the spot where the giant wedge had been, I found nothing but an outline. Scorched into the wooden floorboards, the shape was still discernible, a perfect imprint of that massive piece. An accurate odor hung in the air, reminiscent of burnt plastic and ozone. My heart pounded harder as though responding to the emptiness. I stood there hunched and trembling, uncertain whether I should be relieved or horrified. Part of me wanted to tear the attic apart, uncovering every secret it might hold. Another part of me wanted to run and never look back. My eyes darted around, scanning for movement boxes lay scattered thick with dust, but none seemed disturbed in the hush. I realized I was waiting to hear that low whirring of machinery again or to see a familiar red glow. Neither came. The quiet was deafening, pressing in on me until I thought my eardrums might burst. It took all my willpower to climb back down the ladder after returning to the corridor. I locked the attic door even so the sense of being watched persisted. The house felt like it was full of hidden passages, each leading to a place I shouldn't go. Occasionally, a clicking noise from upstairs would jolt me into full alert, but when I listened carefully, it was always just the house settling. Or so I told myself, my spine still ached, a constant reminder that the wedge was inside me, or at least part of it. The 3-hour cycle that once haunted me seemed to have vanished, replaced by an uneasy silence that might have been worse. I felt poised on a razor's edge of tension, as though expecting some final, catastrophic manifestation. Yet day after day passed with no supernatural occurrences. Just me, my stiff back, and the creeping paranoia that something in this house was biding its time now. When I pass through that corridor at night, I still feel the thick silence. The overhead light flickers and I tense up, expecting the wedge piece to fly out of nowhere. My senses remain on high alert, scanning for any sign of movement or mechanical hum. My body often shudders with cold sweat at the memory of that giant block pulsing in the attic. At times I reach behind my back, pressing my fingers gently against the ridges of my spine, half afraid I'll feel an artificial shape, and maybe I do something not quite bone, not quite plastic, hidden beneath muscle and skin. Though I haven't dared return to the workshop to attempt rebuilding the model, I can't escape the nagging curiosity that tugs at me some nights when the wind is right. I imagine I hear the faintest tune of those pieces orbiting in the air again, clicking together in some malicious harmony. Other times I dream of the wedge massive luminous calling to me from the attic with a steady heartbeat. Like glow, my own pulse quickens, matching its rhythm until I wake up, gasping, drenched in sweat. I haven't told anyone the full story. There are no words that could properly convey the primal dread of witnessing inanimate objects come to life or the horror of feeling your body invaded by something not of this world. When I try to articulate it, I fall silent, terrified that voicing these thoughts might give them strength. Instead, I carry my secret like a brand, my spine forever changed if I stand completely still and focus. Sometimes I feel a faint vibration where the wedge should be. It's as though gears are turning just beneath my skin, waiting, and in that waiting I sense an awful promise this is not over. It never was. Every so often I revisit the attic hatch drawn there by a pull I can't explain. The hatch remains sealed, but my gaze lingers on it, imagining the giant wedge piece still lurking within, or perhaps something else entirely. The corridor's silence weighs heavily and my breath comes in tight, deliberate gulps. I can't shake the unease that one day that piece or another part of it will resume its relentless pursuit, flinging itself at me with renewed force. Until then, I exist in a tense equilibrium, haunted by the knowledge that my spine isn't what it used to be, that I have become a living extension of the model I once tried to create. And whenever the overhead light dims just a little too much, I feel my heart rate spike, a fresh wave of cold sweat crawling over my scalp, because I know in my bones or in the plastic that replaced them that whatever visited me is still here, quietly waiting for its next move story. I felt the first rupture the moment I turned on the hallway, light a crackling surge that defied sound. The bulb shattered in a flash so bright it scorched the edges of my vision. Tiny shards drifted to the floor like stardust suspended in the air, each piece reflecting a phrase I recognized from common therapy prompts. The confusion was immediate. How could such standard questions appear inside fragmented glass? My pulse hammered against my rib cage and I fought the urge to run. Instead, I watched the gentle twinkle of words that read something about feelings, about avoidance, about opening up. I looked away, yet an unsettling hush swallowed the corridor, a vacuum of noise that gave me no choice but to acknowledge what was happening. That was the moment I realized my life was about to detour into a reality I was neither prepared for nor entirely willing to confront. I'm a 38-year-old man, pragmatic to a fault. Until recently, I would have dismissed anything remotely supernatural or psychosomatic as pure fantasy. But that night, as I crouched to sweep up the debris, I saw the phrases shining in the dust. They slid across the floor like skittering insects, forming and reforming structures of half-finished sentences. My first instinct was to ignore them, convinced that my stress was fueling some kind of bizarre illusion. Yet no matter how many times I blinked, the swirling glow remained. The phrases assembled themselves into a single directive that demanded my attention. Fail, so I observe I knew enough Portuguese to sense its meaning. Talk about what you avoid. Observing it was an unnerving command every time I tried to disregard it. The shards wriggled closer, heading for my bare feet. The fear thrummed through my body, my breath tangling in my throat. I had avoided therapy for months. Countless friends and even a former girlfriend had suggested I seek professional help for my anxieties and nightmares. In one of my last half-hearted attempts, I'd even written down the contact information of a recommended therapist. Yet each time I considered following through, a new reason arose to postpone the decision. An unexpected work project, a sudden wave of fatigue, or a flimsy financial worry. Rationally, I knew these were excuses, but I never imagined my reluctance would manifest itself in exploding bulbs and radiant slivers of glass that spelled out unspoken confessions. Over the next few days, the corridor became a stage for a series of unnerving events. I would think vaguely about scheduling a session, and light bulbs would pop still in total silence, showering the hallway with those incandescent fragments. A dull ache would form behind my eyes as I stared down at the glowing dust, each piece shimmering with phrases that battered at my guilt. They asked me about my childhood, my fears, my regrets. They reminded me of the emptiness I felt each morning and the dread that seeped into my thoughts at night. My heart pounded in my chest like a caged animal, sweat dampening the back of my neck, and my vision sometimes blurred as if my mind refused to handle what it was witnessing. I avoided reading those words for as long as possible, sweeping them up swiftly and tossing them into the trash. But one evening I faltered. The shards had formed something that looked like an army of luminescent ants, each piece scurrying in patterns too deliberate to be random with the broom in my hand. I froze. The shimmering fragments crawled onto my slippers, their edges nibbling at the fabric. My breathing became ragged and my arms broke out in goosebumps. I was pinned between the desire to brush them off and the urge to see what they were spelling out. My hands trembled so violently that I nearly dropped the broom. Finally, I caved and let my eyes trace the words they spelled. Talk about what you avoid. Observing my stomach clenched, I felt a chill crawl up the length of my spine as if invisible hands were pressing into the small of my back. My heart's tempo kicked up another notch, the rhythm pulsing in my temples. I wondered if I was having a panic attack. Maybe I was simply losing my mind for a moment. I heard the heavy thud of my own heartbeat in my ears, and that sense of unreality made me question everything I had believed about the world. The luminous fragments, as if satisfied with my attention, scattered around me in a neat circle. Then in one breathtaking move, they converged and arranged themselves into what looked like a small dazzling chair. In the middle of the hallway, I stared at that radiant seat, the brilliance forcing me to squint. The faint hum of electricity like a swarm of bees emanated from it, sending my nerves aflutter, unable to remain in that oppressive silence. I hurriedly stepped forward to disperse the shards. They drifted apart at my approach, returning to a dusty glow on the floor. My entire body felt wrong, my muscles tight, my throat stinging with dryness. I forced myself to drink a glass of water, but the unsettling sensations lingered that night. I made a promise to myself to schedule the therapy session. Part of me believed the bizarre phenomena would vanish. If I took real action the next morning, I dialed the therapist's number, feeling the sting of shame, relief, and a faint hope that I could regain. Normally, I booked an appointment for the following week. After hanging up, I noticed that my hallway was oddly tranquil, no shattered bulbs, no flickering shapes on the floor. The relief was immediate, as though the house itself exhaled in unison with me. My shoulders relaxed for the first time in days, and I dared to believe this ordeal might be over, but a single light remained intact in the corridor, a new bulb I'd installed after the string of explosions, and even though it did not shatter, it began to pulse. Gently, I barely noticed it at first, but then realized it matched the exact rhythm of my heartbeat when I felt a flutter of anxiety. The bulb flickered faster, throbbing in a synchronized echo of my panic. If my heart rate slowed, so did the glowing pattern. The more I paid attention to it, the more disconcerting it became. I'd tried to ignore it, focusing on mundane activities like cooking or watching television, only to catch it out of the corner of my eye, blinking in perfect tempo with my pulse. The sight made my mouth go dry, and it felt like a silent observer monitoring every flicker of stress in my body. As the day of the session approached, I felt an irrational urge to cancel work had become complicated, and I reasoned that this might be a legitimate excuse the moment I considered it. The hallway bulb pulsed with rapid, almost frantic intensity. I could feel my heart struggling to keep up with the erratic pace, my breath quickening until I nearly hyperventilated. It was as if the lamp was warning me, or perhaps feeding off my reluctance. I tried to resist the thought of canceling, forcing myself to commit to that appointment, but the temptation lingered 2 days later. I stood in the hallway again, this time in front of the light that never broke. I felt a spike of frustration and fear, my palms slick with sweat because I could sense the walls closing in. It was a simple question in my mind, something about whether I should postpone the therapy to focus on a looming work deadline. Instantly, the lamp's glow started to flicker at an alarming speed, each flash matching the frantic hammer of my heart. I forced myself to look away and grip the edge of the nearest table for balance. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat, and my mind felt like it was swimming through thick water. I wanted to tell myself this was impossible, that it was all stress, induced hysteria, but the physical presence of that pulsing light shattered any illusions of normalcy. In the quiet stillness of that corridor, I began to wonder if something more insidious was at play. Perhaps my psyche had conjured these manifestations, a subconscious desire to push me toward therapy, but it all felt so tangible, so inexorably real. The oppressive atmosphere weighed on me, and I thought I heard scraping sounds behind the walls, like nails or tiny claws. Itching to break through, the faint hiss of static seemed to bleed from every electrical fixture, intensifying in the corners of the hallway. My skin crawled with the feeling that I was being watched, though I could never pinpoint a pair of eyes in the darkness. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more my senses rebelled, making it impossible to deny the supernatural edge to my predicament on the eve of my appointment. I slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares in which the entire building flickered like a vast array of angry stars. In those dreams, the corridor extended indefinitely, lined with bulbs that all burst in silent synchronicity. The shards formed words I didn't dare read, and I ran barefoot over their cutting edges until a final lamp at the end of the passage blinked faster and faster, threatening to consume me in its radiance. I woke drenched in sweat, my chest tight, my lips chapped and cracked. My heart thundered so fiercely that for a moment I thought it might tear its way out of my body. Morning arrived with heavy overcast skies. The gloom that pressed against my windows matched the dread in my chest. I got dressed, fighting the urge to call the therapist's office and invent an excuse. The lamp in the hallway flickered as soon as I let the idea cross my mind. I took a deep breath that felt like sandpaper in my throat, grabbed my keys, and forced myself out the door. The corridor seemed to breathe behind me, the shadows shifting in ways that didn't align with the light from the remaining bulb. I hurried down the stairs, feeling the intangible weight of that single lamp's pulse. Following me, my car ride to the therapist's office was punctuated by trembling fingers on the steering wheel, every bump in the road echoing in my bones. The waiting room was modest: soft chairs, muted colors, a faint smell of lavender. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The overhead lamps were steady, unremarkable, yet I found my gaze wandering nervously to each bulb, half expecting them to explode at any moment. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt beads of sweat forming along my hairline. Other patients waited with calm indifference, and I envied their ignorance of the bizarre phenomena that trailed me like a shadow when the therapist finally ushered me in. I spoke haltingly, trying to describe the surreal events without sounding completely unhinged. I avoided looking directly at her expression, focusing instead on the pattern of the carpet beneath my feet. In a calm and measured tone, she suggested stress might be manifesting in very peculiar ways, but she didn't dismiss the possibility of something more intangible. I sensed she was carefully picking her words, hinting that I should continue to attend sessions to explore these experiences further. My skin prickled with renewed anxiety, and I felt a slight trembling in my legs as though the floor might open up beneath me. Yet there was also a semblance of validation in her reaction. I left the office with a card listing future appointments and a swirl of conflicting emotions, uncertain if anything had changed or if everything had. In the days that followed, I kept my next session date in mind, and for the most part, the corridor remained calm, yet the single unbroken lamp still pulsed. Whenever I let the thought of canceling cross my mind, each flicker set off a wave of cold sweat across my body. My spine tingling with electric urgency, I found that if I immediately reaffirmed my commitment to therapy, the light would slow to a more stable glow, as if a tenuous peace had been restored. Still, my sense of being watched didn't subside. Late at night, I'd hear faint creaks beneath the floorboards as though something was shifting or crawling just out of sight. I checked for rodents or leaks, but found nothing tangible. The air itself seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe, especially when I walked past that lamp still vigilantly tracking my heart rate one evening. Desperation got the better of me, overwhelmed by mounting deadlines. I grabbed my phone with the intention to reschedule the instant I placed my finger on the contact icon. The lamp's light became unbearably bright. My chest seized in a spasmodic clench, and my vision blurred around the edges. I heard a sizzling noise that seemed to vibrate right into my skull, as if electricity were arcing through the air in an invisible storm. My heart pounded wildly. My mouth turned to chalk, and I tasted the metallic tang of fear. It was as if the entire corridor wanted to swallow me. Slowly, I removed my finger from the phone, and the lamp dimmed back to its normal rhythmic flicker. My lungs felt like I'd just surfaced from deep water. I sank to the floor, trembling so violently my teeth chattered. In that moment, I understood I wasn't merely dealing with an overactive imagination. Something beyond my comprehension was determined to keep me on a path of confrontation with my own psyche. My sessions continued. Each time I stepped into the hallway to leave, I braced myself, expecting another silent detonation or wave of shards gathering at my feet. But it remained calm as long as I maintained my resolve to face whatever I'd been running from during therapy. I talked about old grievances, regrets, and the suffocating dread of being alone in my apartment. I acknowledged how I'd always thrown myself into work to avoid introspection. The more I talked, the more those nightmares receded into a dull buzz, though the lamp never ceased its quiet monitoring of my pulse. Occasionally, I thought I saw shapes moving just beyond the periphery of my vision in the hallway. Indistinct shadows slid across walls, fading whenever I turned to confront them. My entire body would tense, heart racing, the dryness in my mouth returning like a reflex. Yet no matter how far I ventured, I found no intruders. Just the old cracked plaster and that single unbroken bulb. In time, I began to suspect that the force behind these events was connected to parts of myself I'd repressed whenever I tried to give up on therapy. The manifestations grew stronger, more vicious. Whenever I leaned into the sessions unraveling pieces of my own darkness, the tension at home eased. Still, I never felt entirely safe every night. Before drifting to sleep, I imagined that lamp in the hallway throbbing in tandem with my heart. I could almost feel it drawing the secrets out of me, illuminating corners of my mind I'd kept in shadow last week. I came dangerously close to canceling again. I gripped my phone, anxious and frustrated with how the sessions dredged up painful memories. The corridor felt especially dark that night, the walls seeming to lean inward as though they might collapse. The lamp's glow pulsed violently, matching the speed of my spiraling thoughts. A wave of nausea slammed into me and I slumped to the floor, cold sweat rolling down my forehead. My tongue felt like sandpaper and my breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps. For a split second, I thought I saw the luminous shards again swirling at the edges of my vision. They whispered about secrets, about shame, about a life half lived. I put my phone down, trembling, and the flickering slowed. Letting me catch my breath this morning, I attended another session, stepping into that familiar office where the lights, thankfully, remained stable. My therapist noted progress in my demeanor. Fewer anxious tics, more willingness to discuss painful chapters of my past. Yet a persistent tension sat coiled in the pit of my stomach, as if I were bracing for a final confrontation with the unknown presence that haunted my corridor when I came home. I paused in front of that solitary lamp, the corridor bathed in a dull throbbing light that matched the pace of my heart. For an instant, I felt I was standing at the threshold between two worlds, the one where I denied my issues and watched light bulbs explode in silent fury, and the one where I confronted my demons as I write this. That bulb continues its relentless vigil, blinking with every beat in my chest. The air feels charged heavy. I can still sense a shape in the corner of my eye, drifting along the wall. It never steps forward, never reveals itself fully, but it's there. A reminder that there are parts of my own mind I haven't fully laid bare. Sometimes I wonder if healing will make it disappear or if acknowledging it will strengthen its hold. The very act of questioning has my heart beating faster and the light quickens. In response, I'm caught in a psychotherapy as an exorcism of the intangible. Each session pulls me away from the precipice of unreason, while each moment of doubt sends me back to that flickering corridor. The tension is almost suffocating, yet I sense a path forward. I don't know if I'll ever rid my home or myself of the presence that's been awakened, but I do know I can't keep looking away every day. I choose not to cancel. Is another day I preserve a precarious peace, and yet a persistent hum resonates beneath the silence. A subtle promise that if I ever surrender to my old habits, the corridor will erupt again in a silent, terrifying dance of shattered glass and shimmering words. I taste fear like metal on my tongue, and my lungs feel tight. But for now, I am still here. The lamp still pulses. My heart still beats. And I move forward step by trembling step into a reality I can neither flee nor fully embrace. Story 7, I still remember the first time I noticed something wasn't right with my new place. The atmosphere felt thick, like entering a room where something dreadful had just happened. But there was no immediate explanation for why my skin prickled or why the silence felt so charged. It was supposed to be just a routine renovation fix. The creaking floorboards paint the peeling walls and install new blinds. Yet the moment I stepped onto that veranda, the air shifted. A scorching late afternoon sun had painted the sky in swirls of gold and crimson. My heart kicked in my chest, and I tried to dismiss the wave of unease as simple nerves from moving into a new home. But deep down, I sensed something was off. I'm a straightforward man, not given to flights of fancy. The property was a steal, and despite the suspiciously low price, I was determined to transform it into a comfortable retreat. The structure itself was sound, thick walls, sturdy foundation, and a veranda that faced west. Designed to catch the sunset, I was thrilled about that veranda. I'd pictured myself unwinding every evening with a drink while the sky performed its nightly spectacle. But no one had warned me how intense those sunsets would be out here, especially after the place started coming back to life under renovation. Nor did they mention that the blinds would operate on their own, betraying my desire for privacy. The first time the blinds moved by themselves, I thought it was an electrical glitch. One afternoon, I heard a mechanical hum from the living room. My pulse quickened as I rushed in, still holding a paintbrush, dripping white paint, the blinds freshly installed and set to remain firmly closed during the dusty renovation were steadily rolling up. They revealed a flawlessly picturesque sunset, a warm glow that lit the bare walls with an otherworldly sheen. Yet something was wrong with the sky itself. Beyond the blazing reds and oranges, I glimpsed a thin vertical slash of pure black. It looked like someone had torn a seam in the clouds. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear the blood rushing in my ears when I tried to focus on that dark tier. It seemed to vanish every time my eyes locked onto it. I saw only the normal gradient of twilight, but from the corner of my vision, the black line persisted like a silent threat. I told myself it might be an odd reflection or a trick of the light. Still, a trick of the light doesn't usually turn your gut and make you doubt what you've seen. I felt a chill even in the suffocating summer heat, and I scrambled to shut the blinds, but the motor refused to respond. Pressing the wall switch did nothing. The blinds stayed open, exposing the entire living room to that unsettling panorama. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated every hot afternoon. I'd detect the faint whir of the motor, and the blinds would creep upward, allowing that molten sky to flood the room each time the vertical slash returned, looming just beyond. Remained stable. My therapist noted progress in my demeanor. Fewer anxious tics, more willingness to discuss painful chapters of my past. Yet a persistent tension sat coiled in the pit of my stomach, as if I were bracing for a final confrontation with the unknown presence that haunted my corridor when I came home. I paused in front of that solitary lamp, the corridor bathed in a dull throbbing light that matched the pace of my heart. For an instant, I felt I was standing at the threshold between two worlds, the one where I denied my issues and watched light bulbs explode in silent fury, and the one where I confronted my demons as I write this. That bulb continues its relentless vigil, blinking with every beat in my chest. The air feels charged heavy. I can still sense a shape in the corner of my eye, drifting along the wall. It never steps forward, never reveals itself fully, but it's there. A reminder that there are parts of my own mind I haven't fully laid bare. Sometimes I wonder if healing will make it disappear or if acknowledging it will strengthen its hold. The very act of questioning has my heart beating faster and the light quickens. In response, I'm caught in a psychotherapy as an exorcism of the intangible. Each session pulls me away from the precipice of unreason, while each moment of doubt sends me back to that flickering corridor. The tension is almost suffocating, yet I sense a path forward. I don't know if I'll ever rid my home or myself of the presence that's been awakened, but I do know I can't keep looking away every day. I choose not to cancel. Is another day I preserve a precarious peace, and yet a persistent hum resonates beneath the silence. A subtle promise that if I ever surrender to my old habits, the corridor will erupt again in a silent, terrifying dance of shattered glass and shimmering words. I taste fear like metal on my tongue, and my lungs feel tight. But for now, I am still here. The lamp still pulses. My heart still beats. And I move forward step by trembling step into a reality I can neither flee nor fully embrace. Story 7, I still remember the first time I noticed something wasn't right with my new place. The atmosphere felt thick, like entering a room where something dreadful had just happened. But there was no immediate explanation for why my skin prickled or why the silence felt so charged. It was supposed to be just a routine renovation fix. The creaking floorboards paint the peeling walls and install new blinds. Yet the moment I stepped onto that veranda, the air shifted. A scorching late afternoon sun had painted the sky in swirls of gold and crimson. My heart kicked in my chest, and I tried to dismiss the wave of unease as simple nerves from moving into a new home. But deep down, I sensed something was off. I'm a straightforward man, not given to flights of fancy. The property was a steal, and despite the suspiciously low price, I was determined to transform it into a comfortable retreat. The structure itself was sound, thick walls, sturdy foundation, and a veranda that faced west. designed to catch the sunset, I was thrilled about that veranda. I'd pictured myself unwinding every evening with a drink while the sky performed its nightly spectacle, but no one had warned me how intense those sunsets would be out here, especially after the place started coming back to life under renovation. Nor did they mention that the blinds would operate on their own, betraying my desire for privacy. The first time the blinds moved by themselves, I thought it was an electrical glitch. One afternoon, I heard a mechanical hum from the living room. My pulse quickened as I rushed in, still holding a paintbrush, dripping white paint. The blinds, freshly installed and set to remain firmly closed during the dusty renovation, were steadily rolling up. They revealed a flawlessly picturesque sunset, a warm glow that lit the bare walls with an otherworldly sheen. Yet something was wrong with the sky itself. Beyond the blazing reds and oranges, I glimpsed a thin vertical slash of pure black. It looked like someone had torn a seam in the clouds. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear the blood rushing in my ears when I tried to focus on that dark tier. It seemed to vanish every time my eyes locked onto it. I saw only the normal gradient of twilight, but from the corner of my vision, the black line persisted like a silent threat. I told myself it might be an odd reflection or a trick of the light. Still, a trick of the light doesn't usually turn your gut and make you doubt what you've seen. I felt a chill even in the suffocating summer heat, and I scrambled to shut the blinds, but the motor refused to respond. Pressing the wall switch did nothing. The blinds stayed open, exposing the entire living room to that unsettling panorama. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated every hot afternoon. I'd detect the faint whir of the motor, and the blinds would creep upward, allowing that molten sky to flood the room each time the vertical slash returned, looming just beyond. My direct focus. My breathing grew shallow whenever I glimpsed it, the hairs on my forearms rising in protest. Then came the next anomaly, the sweet floral fragrance that drifted through the veranda. At first, I assumed neighbors might be pruning some exotic blooms, or that leftover cleaning solution from the renovation might be mixing with the warm air. But no flowers had been planted around the house, and all the cleaning products smelled harsh and chemical, not delicate and inviting. This perfume was reminiscent of lies and rose petals, yet subtler, tinged with a sense of decay I couldn't quite place whenever it enveloped me. My throat tightened and my palms dampened with sweat. Not long after, the dust that gathered daily on the unfinished surfaces began shifting. It wasn't random swirling patterns from the breeze, but faint letters forming across the windowsill and sometimes on the floorboards near the veranda. I recognized that the words weren't in modern Spanish or Portuguese. I have just enough language knowledge to sense something archaic in the letters. They spelled out phrases that repeated every few days, always the same observicar. My chest constricted as I read it. Something about those words filled me with mounting dread, like a warning or a command. There was no one else around yet. I felt watched one evening. I decided to document the bizarre phenomenon, if only to prove to myself later that I hadn't imagined it. I took out my phone and carefully captured a photograph of the veranda, the blazing sun dropping below the horizon and that vertical black slash in the sky. For the brief instant my camera's lens caught it, that slash seemed to widen, warping into a gaping mouth. I swear I saw something akin to drool, though it was more like black ink dripping from the edges of that ragged opening. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My heartbeat thundered. I flicked through the phone screen. The image was horrifying, a direct contradiction of the serene sunset. Yet I pressed save, convinced that at least now I had proof. Morning brought a sense of relief, albeit fleeting. I woke up expecting to find the photo on my phone as incriminating evidence of my wavering sanity, but it was gone. There was no trace of that file, not even in the device's recently deleted folder. Instead, I discovered something else entirely on the ledge of the roof, a small area accessible by an old ladder. There was now a dark, reflective shard of glass. I had never seen it before. It was about the size of my palm, angled precisely toward the horizon where the sun set. Despite the day's thick clouds and drizzling rain, it projected an image of that same fiery sunset onto my rooftop. Nausea churned in my stomach as I stood there, water droplets running down my neck, staring at a miniature version of the sky's nightly spectacle playing out on this dark shard. I tried covering it with a tarp weighed down with bricks, but the moment I lowered the cover, a powerful gust of wind manifested from inside the house, snapping the tarp off and rattling every window in the place. My pulse raced as I fought against the wind, my muscles straining to hold the tarp in place, yet each time the force tore it away as though the house itself was refusing to let me conceal that glass. Days bled into one another under this oppressive routine. Each afternoon, the heat would intensify, the veranda's floral perfume would drift in, and the blinds would hum before revealing that sky, the slash or mouth. Whatever it was hovered at the fringes of my vision. It was always there, teasing me, daring me to look straight at it, and every time I tried, it vanished, leaving behind only an afterimage that made my heart race uncontrollably. My sleep suffered. I would jolt awake in the middle of the night, cold sweat clinging to my back, certain I'd heard the blinds rising in the darkness on inspection. They were always in the same position I'd left them, but my nerves were shot. I lost hours of rest, dreading what I might find when the sun started its descent again. Occasionally, friends asked how the renovation was going. One in particular messaged me, concerned about my stress. I replied vaguely that things were unusual. I didn't dare go into detail. I feared the reaction. If I told them about a house that seemingly breathed about dust, that formed archaic Spanish sentences, and about a black wound in the sky that turned into a drooling mouth in photographs. Some nights I would stand in the unlit living room, phone in hand, wanting to call someone just to share my distress, but the words lodged in my throat. Even thinking about describing this madness left my lips dry and my throat tight, despite the logical part of my mind insisting there must be a rational explanation. Each new day chipped away at that doubt. One late afternoon, the sun's blaze was especially brutal. The veranda's sweet cloying perfume wafted through every open window. My tongue felt thick in my mouth, and sweat plastered my shirt to my skin. I nearly dropped the paint roller when I turned around and noticed the dust swirling in the hallway, forming a new phrase. This time it said, "Observare ficar par." My knees went weak. I sank to the floor, trembling, struggling to breathe. It felt as though something powerful and ancient was commanding me to witness events beyond my comprehension. A surge of paranoia enveloped me, and I was convinced I wasn't alone in that corridor. The walls seemed to murmur the very air, pressing down on me, urging me to give in, desperate for solace. I retreated outside. The sky was a dramatic blood orange, and there it was again. The vertical rip in reality at the edge of my vision. It flickered like a hallucination, an omen that refused to fully reveal itself. My breath came in sharp bursts, and I tried not to look toward the horizon yet. When I lowered my gaze, I spotted the shard of glass on the rooftop, reflecting a perfect cloudless sunset that didn't match the actual sky. The feeling of being watched intensified. My heart slammed in my chest, and an involuntary shiver skated down my spine. It was like every shadow in that neglected yard was straining toward me. Craving my gaze, I mustered the courage to address this directly, albeit with minimal contact. A contractor came by for a quick inspection of the roofing beams. I asked in the most casual tone I could manage if he'd noticed anything unusual about the veranda or the blinds. He seemed surprised by my question, but admitted he felt a strange energy the moment he stepped onto the veranda, like walking into a room where a candle has just been snuffed out. He joked that I must have bought some haunted house. Although I laughed politely inside, I felt faint. My suspicions weren't the product of pure hallucination. Then another person sensed something still. He didn't mention seeing a slash in the sky or catching any bizarre scents when he left. I felt oddly more isolated, like the house had singled me out by now. The illusions, or whatever they were, had become more intense. I would catch glimpses of movement in mirrors or windows, shadows shape-shifting into forms I couldn't name. The dust letters would appear even in rooms I just cleaned. My stomach stayed tight, and I found myself trembling at the slightest creak in the house. One afternoon, the smell of non-existent flowers grew so thick that I staggered onto the veranda, gasping for fresh air. The second I stepped outside, an unsettling hum filled my ears like distant chanting. My breath caught and beads of sweat dripped down my temples. I stared at the horizon again, and my peripheral vision revealed that black tear wider than ever, pulsating like a wound. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering when I finally opened them. The tear was gone, leaving the same golden pink sunset as if nothing were wrong, but the stench of my own perspiration and dread told me otherwise. I knew I couldn't keep living this way each day. I grew more convinced the house wanted me to surrender to its demands to spend every sunset transfixed by that horrifying anomaly in the sky. The Spanish phrase haunted me. Observe Icar as though once you witness it, you cannot leave, or once you truly see it, you belong to it. I refused to give in. Bolstered by the last remnants of my rationale, I devised a plan to leave before the final stage of renovation. I'd let the place sit unoccupied, hire remote workers, do whatever it took, so I wouldn't have to endure another cursed sunset here. I began packing at sunrise, throwing clothes into a duffel bag, heart drumming with tense anticipation. All morning, the house felt oddly silent, as though it was holding its breath. The heat was stifling, and not a single trace of dust lettering appeared. I caught myself glancing repeatedly at the windows, expecting the blinds to snap open, but they stayed shut, almost cooperative around noon. The sky clouded over, promising a downpour. Rain hammered the roof for a few hours. I felt a cautious optimism, imagining I'd slip out under the storm's cover, but then I heard a crack, a brittle sound like glass under pressure. I raced to the veranda and saw the shard of dark glass on the roof trembling in the wind. It was projecting impossibly the same fiery sunset onto my ceiling. Even though the actual sky outside was gray and pouring, my stomach lurched, the air around me turned thick perfumed with those phantom flowers again. The blind shot up with a war-revealing thick raindrops pelting the horizon, and yet that blazing sunset existed in the reflection on the ceiling, unwavering, defiant. My vision swam with tears and sweat, and my pulse soared. My every nerve screamed for me to flee. I approached the front door, bag in hand. The handle turned without resistance, but as I pulled, a sudden gust of wind slammed it shut from the inside, nearly knocking me off balance. My lungs seized as I fought the doorknob with clammy hands. It refused to budge in that moment. A realization cut through me like a jolt of electricity. The house was not passively haunted, it was actively preventing my escape. I felt the swirl of stale air behind me, and it carried that archaic phrase like a whisper against my ear. Even though no one was speaking, my breathing hitched, and my heart felt like it would burst from my chest, summoning a surge of adrenaline. I tried again, pushing with all my might, my muscles quivering. Finally, I managed to pry the door open against the invisible force. My lungs burned as I stumbled onto the porch. The rain lashing my face outside, the floral scent evaporated in the storm, replaced by the earthy smell of wet soil. A sense of triumph and terror coursed through me. I sprinted to my car, the wind slamming droplets into my eyes. Even as I turned the ignition and roared down the muddy road, part of me dreaded what I might see in the rearview mirror. I didn't dare look back. The house could have been a looming silhouette, the veranda lit by a sunset that wasn't supposed to exist, but I kept my gaze forward, knuckles white on the steering wheel. I haven't returned since. Sometimes I wake from dreams soaked in sweat, images of that vertical slash burned into my eyelids. I recall the musty smell of dust forming words that insisted on being read, the unstoppable blinds and the shard of glass that reflected a reality all its own. I still feel the phantom ache in my chest when I remember the final gust of wind resisting my departure. Maybe the house let me go, or maybe it didn't care to keep me. Either way, I can't forget the sensation that something wanted me to stay and watch that terrifying sky open up completely. Even now, if I close my eyes, I sense that black tear, that cosmic mouth drooling shadows waiting just out of sight. And I wonder if in leaving I truly escaped whatever it was, or if it simply followed me, lodged in my periphery, ready to reveal itself the moment I relax. The memory alone makes my heart pound. The fleeting relief I feel each morning is overshadowed by a nagging certainty. The phenomenon is out there somewhere, waiting. And no matter how far I run, I can still hear those dust-formed words echo in my mind. Observe iCar Story 8, they say there's a split second just before you register that something is terribly wrong when the atmosphere around you seems to hold its breath. You feel it on your skin, a sudden tension in the air, like the calm before a thunderstorm. I experienced that moment the night the rain fell so heavily that I thought the windshield might cave in. Under the onslaught, the minute I caught sight of the small black cat reflected in my rearview mirror, even though I knew the interior of my car was bone dry, I felt that hush. It was as if reality hesitated, giving me just enough time to sense that I was no longer alone, and that whatever had joined me was outside the realm of what I understood. I've always considered myself practical. I've never been one to scare easily. But that night, the sky was a mass of rolling black clouds, and my heart hammered in my chest like it wanted to escape. I was stuck on a winding road with no streetlights for miles. My only illumination came from the car's headlights as they sliced through the curtain of rain. The relentless drone of water pelting the windshield created a hypnotic rhythm that made the darkness feel alive, pulsing with every gust of wind. If I craned my neck, I could see the silhouettes of twisted branches overhead swaying as if trying to claw their way into the sky. I remember wiping at my eyes, convinced I'd seen something in the rearview mirror that defied reason. There in a fleeting flash was the reflection of a tiny black cat perched on the back seat. The interior light of the car was off, and I hadn't opened the doors in hours, so there was no logical way for water to seep in or for a stray animal to sneak inside. My breath caught in my throat. When I glanced again, it was gone, but the sense of being observed lingered, crawling under my skin. Even my peripheral vision seemed to pick up faint flickers of movement behind me. Almost on cue, my windshield wipers, already fighting the torrential downpours, suddenly lurched. They began to squeak across the glass at an erratic tempo, pausing just long enough for me to see that the watery smears on the glass spelled out a word, Volulta. My stomach tightened so abruptly that I thought I'd be sick. It wasn't some random set of streaks. It looked deliberate, as if an unseen hand had guided the water to form those 5 letters. I clenched the steering wheel knuckles, turning white. The rational side of me insisted it was just a weird pattern of the rain, but my gut told me otherwise. My nerves were in shreds by the time the storm finally slowed. Rainlight glistened off the asphalt, and the night air felt thick as though something oppressive lurked among the swirling mist. I told myself I needed to keep driving to get off that road and find a place with bright lights and other people, anything to feel less alone. But even as I accelerated, the engine started making an unsettling noise, a low resonant meow that reverberated through the chassis. It was nothing like any mechanical failure I'd heard before. My pulse throbbed in my ears and my breath caught in my chest. The sound continued, a guttural rumble that mimicked an angry cat's growl. Meanwhile, the steering wheel began to vibrate as if something beneath the dashboard was scratching, trying to dig its way out desperate. I recalled that there was a gas station a couple miles up the road. The place had always been a reliable stop, although it was late. I hoped there would be an attendant on duty. I kept one eye on the flickering reflection in my mirror, half expecting to see the cat again. Each time the engine coughed out that eerie meow, I felt my stomach twist. My palms grew slick with sweat, and I could hear my heart hammering in the silence that seemed to swell between each tortured sound. It didn't help that the seat beneath me felt oddly warm, as though I'd left a heater on, yet the controls for the car's heating system were all off by the time I arrived at the gas station. The atmosphere felt impossibly still. Even though the overhead fluorescents buzzed and the distant hum of a highway was audible, I stepped out, noticing immediately that the seats remained dry and unmarked, yet my rear view mirror was smeared with muddy paw prints. From the inside, they seemed to fade as soon as I blinked, leaving just a faint residue behind the attendant on duty. An older man with tired eyes started asking me about my car. He hinted he'd seen something small and agile leap into the undercarriage, possibly making its way up the exhaust pipe. My heart practically stopped. He seemed surprised by my reaction, but I offered him no real explanation. Instead, I just rubbed my temples, swallowing against a sudden dryness in my mouth. When he finished filling the tank, I could still feel eyes on me from the shadows as I turned back to my vehicle. The soft overhead lighting made the car's paint glimmer with rivulets of moisture that shouldn't have been there. The rain had nearly stopped by then, yet water trickled down the windows as if it had a life of its own. I left the station driving more carefully than before, every muscle in my body tensed as I listened for that low meow. It returned whenever I accelerated, morphing into a throaty purr. If I dared slow down, my mind began to race with theories. Maybe some creature had crawled into the engine for warmth, or maybe I was hallucinating from stress and exhaustion. But each explanation crumbled under the fact that my windshield wiper had spelled out a coherent word. My breath grew ragged and sweat clung to my forehead. By the time I arrived home, the first weak rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. My garage is typically a safe, familiar spot. The overhead lights are bright and the space is organized with shelves of tools and a neat row of spare tires. Yet when I pulled in and turned off the ignition, a suffocating stillness settled around me. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked pale and drawn. My eyes shadowed by fatigue, I stepped out cautiously, half expecting to see paw prints across the seat. Instead, I saw them on the hood. Fine tracks of soot spiraled around the painted metal. Leading upward, the pattern ended right where my keys rested, as though guiding me to pick them up. The realization that I'd left my keys in the ignition and that something had formed a perfect spiral around them made my skin prickle. I felt a surge of nausea. The footprints weren't shaped exactly like a normal cat's. The front paw prints looked narrower, almost distorted, as if elongated claws had scraped into the soot, leaving delicate furrows behind. I backed away from the car, my hands trembling. Adrenaline spiked in my veins and my breathing turned shallow. The ceiling lights flickered, plunging the garage into brief pockets of darkness. My mind swam with the memory of that cat's reflection, the meowing engine, and the single ominous word Volta. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it had been a bizarre coincidence, a trick of the eyes brought on by exhaustion and fear, but my attempts at rationality faltered whenever I noticed new signs each time I planned a long drive, like setting out a map or making a mental note of a route. The car's sound system would emit faint static. Then hidden inside that static came a soft mewing. It was unmistakable, a cat's cry woven into the electrical hum, as if the creature had found a way to communicate through the very wiring. My blood would run cold, and I'd find myself hesitating to even enter the garage. The thought of the car waiting in the darkness, possibly hosting something unnatural, kept me awake at night. I also started to feel physical effects of the stress. My hands would shake whenever I gripped the steering wheel. My heart would pound as soon as I opened the driver's side door. On a few occasions, I swore I heard scratching from under the seats while I drove. More than once, I pulled over, chest heaving, and searched frantically beneath the car. I never found anything. Still, the seat would be warm when I got back in, and the gear shift would sometimes be dusted with flecks of soot. Everything was subtle enough that I questioned my sanity, except for the nights when I awoke to the faint sound of meowing echoing in my ears, even though there were no stray cats anywhere near my house. As time passed, I felt paranoia lodge itself in my bones. My coworkers mentioned my jumpiness. A neighbor asked if I was sleeping well because I looked exhausted. I couldn't articulate what was happening without sounding deranged, so I gave half-hearted excuses about work stress, yet the anxiety in my gut wouldn't ease. Each day felt heavier than the last, as though a dark shadow hung over me, following me wherever I went. Even routine errands became orals. Driving a short distance would leave me drenched in sweat, the steering wheel slick from my shaking palms. In the silence, my own breathing was too loud. Every bump or rattle from the road sounded like claws scraping metal. At times, I wondered if I was possessed by the idea of a phantom cat, or if there was a genuine supernatural force haunting my vehicle. I tried ignoring it, but the more I pretended nothing was wrong, the more intense the signs became. On a particularly humid night, I started the ignition to go grab dinner. Immediately, the stereo turned on by itself. Despite being switched off, the volume was low, but I heard the unmistakable hiss of static punctuated by a slow, throaty purr. My throat constricted and my eyes stung with tears of dread. The purring escalated into a series of short meows, eerily synchronized with the flicker of the dashboard lights. I killed the engine, stepping out into the darkness with shaking legs. The night air felt cold against the sweat on my skin, and an overwhelming sense of being watched made my scalp prickle. Desperate for some semblance of normalcy, I took the car to a mechanic, explaining only that there was an odd noise coming from under the hood. He checked it thoroughly, then informed me in an uncertain tone that he couldn't find anything amiss. He did mention an unusual smell of burnt material near the exhaust, which he couldn't quite place afterward. The car seemed docile for a short while, but that night as I lay in bed, I heard the faint jingle of my car keys from the kitchen counter. It sounded as if they were being nudged like a small paw, batting them around when I rushed to investigate heart pounding in my throat. I found the keys lying exactly where I'd left them. No sign of disturbance except for a single side paw print next to them. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Nightmares plagued me whenever I managed a few hours of rest. In those dreams, I'd find myself behind the wheel headlights flickering on an endless highway. The reflection of a black cat would appear in the rearview mirror, growing larger and closer until it filled the entire glass. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, with my pulse racing so fast I thought my heart might burst even in daylight. The memory of those dreams clung to me, making every mundane task feel like a prelude to something awful. One evening I found the courage to confront the car head on. I paced in the garage, adrenaline coursing through my body. My hands trembled as I opened the hood. Shining a flashlight into every crevice, the air smelled of metal and gasoline, but there was also a faint musk that reminded me of wet fur. I hovered over the engine, shining the beam of light, half expecting the black cat to leap at my face, but there was nothing tangible there. The next step was to check the underside. I lay on a cardboard sheet flashlight clenched in a sweaty palm. The silence in the garage felt suffocating. My breathing was shallow, and every throb of my pulse echoed in my eardrums. I spotted no creature, but streaks of soot formed strange patterns along the exhaust. They almost looked like scratches or arcane symbols left behind by tiny clawed hands. The moment I scrambled back to my feet, I felt a brush of air behind me, followed by an intense feeling that I was being watched. My mind flashed with images of glossy yellow eyes burning with silent purpose. I spun around heart-hammering, but saw only the walls of the garage and the neatly stored tools. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that I had just narrowly missed seeing something that didn't belong in my world. Some nights I contemplated ditching the car altogether, abandoning it somewhere far from my home. But every time I entertained the idea of a long trip to leave it behind, the same phenomenon would happen. The sound system would crackle, the meowing would start, or a single word. Volta would appear smeared on the window in a haze of condensation. It felt like a warning or a threat that I was not allowed to just walk away. The notion sank into my subconscious, breeding a suffocating dread. Eventually, I decided that I couldn't continue living in fear of my own vehicle. I needed to face it directly to see if there was a way to dispel whatever presence haunted the machinery. So one night, well past midnight, I locked up my house and stepped into the garage. The air was stale, carrying the faint smell of smoke and gasoline. My heart thumped wildly, the fear coursing through me like electricity, but I forced myself to slide into the driver's seat. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across the interior, making the corners appear deeper and more menacing. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling my pulse in my fingertips. I announced aloud that I intended to drive until sunrise, no matter what happened. My voice wavered, echoing unnaturally in the tight space. The second I turned the key, the engine roared to life with a meow that rattled my nerves. Sweat broke out across my forehead, but I steadied my breathing and reversed out of the garage. The night was eerily calm, the moon hidden behind clouds. Streetlights flickered, casting distorted shadows on the pavement as I drove. The interior lights began to flicker in time with my ragged breathing. The meowing from the engine grew louder, and the steering wheel shuddered in my hands. It felt like the entire car was alive, possessed by a silent fury. My arms ached with the effort of controlling the wheel. For a terrifying instant, the cat's reflection appeared once more in the rearview mirror, eyes glowing in the dark. My heart lurched and I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted blood. Every logical cell in my brain told me this was impossible, but there it was, watching me with a gaze that seemed to probe every fearful thought in my mind. I pressed on, refusing to slow my determination to break free from this curse. This haunting drove me forward. I prayed for dawn to come quickly to burn away these illusions. The car lurched and strained the engine's meow, turning into a wounded howl. The radio burst into static again, echoing with feline cries. My temples pounded with each new wave of sound. I couldn't blink fast enough to clear the sweat and tears from my eyes. Yet despite the terror, I found a glimmer of resolve inside myself ahead. The horizon began to lighten and the thick cloak of night started to retreat. As the first pale streaks of morning sun broke through the gloom, the meowing abruptly ceased. The engine noise returned to its usual hum, steady and mechanical. The vibrations in the steering wheel faded, leaving only a subtle tremor in my exhausted arms. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but the empty back seat. No shadow, no eye's relief washed over me, making my limbs feel weak. My shoulders sagged and a shaky exhale escaped my lips. I continued driving until the sun was fully up, parking at a rest stop bathed in daylight. My hands were still trembling when I turned off the ignition. The oppressive sense of being watched had lifted as though the entity that lurked in my car could not withstand the glare of morning. For a long time, I just sat there letting my heart rate slow, letting my lungs fill with fresh air. I still don't know if the cat was a spirit, a curse, or simply a manifestation of my own fears. Sometimes I hear faint phantom meows when I'm alone in my garage at night, a lingering reminder that the line between the mundane and the impossible can blur under the right circumstances. Maybe I quelled it by facing it head on, or maybe it's still there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to demand a return to that dark highway. Even now, whenever I plan a trip that might stretch past midnight, I feel a prickle along the back of my neck. My keys rattle inexplicably, and the car's dashboard sometimes flickers with an odd glint that reminds me of watchful feline eyes. I haven't seen the word Volta spelled on the windshield again, but the memory remains as vivid as ever. It's the kind of thing that leaves you forever changed, aware that there are corners of this world where logic frays and something else, something predatory, waits to test your resolve. Yes, I can still drive. I can still go about my daily routine, but the echo of that low reverberating meow lurks in my subconscious, reminding me that some encounters latch onto your soul and refuse to loosen their grip when dusk arrives and the garage light flickers. I sometimes hesitate before climbing into the driver's seat. My heart thuds a little harder and a thin sheen of sweat coats my palms, because deep down I know that the boundary I once trusted between reality and the unknown has been breached, and if I dare ignore that fact for too long, I might hear a guttural purr rumbling through the night, beckoning me back to the road I prayed I'd left behind. Story 9, I first sensed the dread in the stillness between gusts of wind there. In that fleeting quiet, the thin walls of my prefabricated module shuddered without any visible cause, almost like the building itself was breathing in time with my pulse. The fluorescent light overhead flickered and a low groan like wood under pressure, though I knew it was all metal and cheap insulation, slipped through the corridors right away, every hair on my arm. Stood on end. This was no ordinary place, nor was it a place for rest or peace. It felt like a living thing that watched me, calculated my movements, and waited for any sign of surrender. I am a doctoral student, a man who long ago clung to the idea that all it took to succeed was persistence, yet even that belief had begun to falter. I moved into this temporary housing on campus to save money and be closer to the lab, but the structure itself proved less a refuge and more a constant source of unease from the outside. It looks mundane, a faded gray rectangle with flimsy siding, but inside it's like a cage of tin that twists and whistles the moment the wind picks up. If I try to ignore the staccato cacks, I hear the doors, two interior doors, and the front entrance rattle on their hinges in an almost rhythmic fashion. Sometimes they slam in unison without any breeze. Each hollow bang reverberates through my chest, tightening my lungs until my breath comes in short, ragged bursts. At first I thought it was just nerves from overwork. My PhD had begun to feel more like an endless tunnel than a stepping stone. The late nights in the lab, the pages of unread articles, the data sets piling up. I believed those slamming doors were an external manifestation of my stress, yet the correlation was too precise to dismiss as mere coincidence. On the mornings I woke up determined to finish my chapters, the doors remained still and quiet, but the second I entertained a mental whisper of giving up, even if only to fantasize about a freer life, a door would slam in the first few weeks it slammed. Once later I heard two quick successive thuds like an urgent command. Then came the day I heard the triple slam. That was the day everything changed. I remember the precise moment of the third slam. The module shook as though struck by a giant's hand. My heart pounded so hard it forced the blood into my ears, drowning out every other noise. With its thumping, adrenaline shot through my veins, leaving me trembling and slightly nauseous. I spent the rest of that day in a kind of half-trance, eyes flickering over the walls, noting odd spots in the paint that I never noticed before. By evening, the hairline cracks in those spots had expanded into a sprawling network of lines, almost like spider webs. They seemed random at first, but when I turned on a powerful flashlight and tilted my head just right, the fissures formed shapes maps, or at least something reminiscent of them. Intrigued, I borrowed an ultrasound device from the lab normally used for material testing and ran it over the cracks. The reading confirmed flaws beneath the surface, hollow pockets, metal fatigue, structural weaknesses. It was as if the paint had peeled back to reveal the building's skeleton. I knew I should report it to campus facilities, but something stopped me. Some strange inertia. My mind was exhausted. The thought of filling out paperwork and explaining the danger felt more daunting than the possibility of the place collapsing, so I ignored it. Procrastination is my constant companion, but in that eerie living space, laziness carried grim consequences. The more I delayed my writing, the more the module responded. I recall sitting at my makeshift desk, a cheap folding table that wobbled every time I leaned forward, watching the ceiling carefully tiny grains of sawdust, though that hardly made sense given the module's composition began to drift down. Each speck seemed to tumble in slow motion, landing on my laptop keyboard or my shoulders, as though counting out the seconds of my idle mind for a moment. Time itself felt suspended, and the hush in the room became deafening. No hum of the refrigerator, no distant footsteps from outside, just the rhythmic drop of falling debris. It was almost hypnotic until a particularly coarse chunk fell onto my hand and jolted me from the trance. My heart thudded and sweat beaded along my temples. I stood up in that instant. The entire module seemed to take a deep breath. The walls expanded with a low groan. The doors sucked themselves shut. My first thought was that some gust of wind or shift in air pressure had caused it, but it felt too synchronized, too alive. As I rose to stretch, intending to finally type a few words on my dissertation, the building eased into a silence that felt almost serene. No more dripping sawdust, no more banging doors. My chest loosened and I could inhale deeply without that sense of impending doom. I took it as a sign the module was giving me permission, offering a sort of truce for the night. Yet whenever I faltered, whenever my fingers hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed by doubt, the cycle started anew. There would be a sharp crack in the ceiling, followed by slow, deliberate taps from behind the walls. My breath would come in ragged gasps, and my skin would tingle with a chilling sweat. The strangest part was the whispering. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a muffled murmur that might have been the wind scraping against the exterior siding. Over time, it coalesced into a phrase I recognized in Portuguese, something that sounded like a chorus of low voices urging desertos adaba. I tried to block it out, telling myself it was exhaustion warping my thoughts. But the phrase lingered, repeating in my mind long after the noise stopped. In sleepless delirium, I began to interpret it as abandon us and collapse, or some twisted invitation to flee. Before living here, I was a rational man. I never believed in haunted houses or malevolent spirits. But as the days wore on, my head spun with the possibility that something beyond my understanding had latched onto me and this flimsy construction. My nights were restless. I'd wake in the small hours with my shirt soaked in sweat, my heart hammering so loudly it felt as if the neighbors could hear it through the walls. Each time I'd switch on the light and see the cracks on the ceiling had grown shaped in new cryptic patterns in the corner, an expanding fissure formed what looked like an ominous arrow pointing directly above where I slept. The air smelled of stale metal and damp insulation. Despite the chill, I felt a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest, and I could swear I wasn't alone in the room. I became paranoid during the day. I'd stare at my surroundings to see if anything had changed. New cracks, more sawdust, or a shift in the floor level. I walked around with the ultrasound device scanning the walls, the joists, the rafters. Each reading returned anomalies, pockets of emptiness, fractures so extensive they defied logic. By all accounts, the module should have collapsed, but it didn't. At least not while I maintained a certain routine. I noticed that if I worked on my dissertation steadily, the structure behaved. The dripping ceased, the door stayed quiet, and even the murmur in the walls subsided. My breathing slowed, my pulse felt steady. I might still be plagued by anxiety over deadlines, but I could function the moment I let procrastination take hold. Maybe I'd scroll through social media or zone out. Watching the ceiling, the building would remind me of its presence. It was as though the entity or the module itself was forcing me to stay on track, but the sense of being coerced by my own home was maddening. My mind teetered on the edge of reason. What if this was all in my head? The thought looped endlessly, colliding with the evidence of my eyes and ears. The strange synchronized slams, the creeping cracks, and that resonating hush. Whenever I tried to break the cycle, when I attempted to talk it out with a colleague in the cafeteria, I barely managed to formulate the words. Instead, I ended up conveying it in an indirect hypothetical manner, asking if he thought an older building might sway or settle. In odd ways, he laughed it off politely, attributing it to architectural quirks. I felt a wave of embarrassment and fear. If it was real, I was alone in this experience. If it was not, then my mental health was spiraling late one afternoon. As the sun lowered behind the campus buildings, I decided to test the limits of this phenomena with trembling hands and a racing pulse. I closed my laptop and vowed not to write a single word for the entire evening. Almost instantly, the air in the module shifted. My ears popped as though we had changed altitude. The door to the bathroom slammed with a force that reverberated through the entire structure. My heart soared into my throat. I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the cold, vibrating metal of the rear wall. Then for a moment, utter silence took over. No humming from the vents, no footsteps outside, no laughter from the dormitory next door. Even my own breath seemed muted, as though it were being stifled by an unseen hand. Then came the sawdust again. This time it rained down in a steady stream. More forceful than ever, it caught the dim orange light of late afternoon, swirling in the half-shadow like a macabre snow globe. The minute particles brushed against my cheeks and hair, making me cough with their dusty dryness. My eyes stung. I tried to speak, but my throat felt so constricted that I couldn't produce a sound. The module creaked, a slow, agonized moan that rose from the floor under my feet. My stomach turned, and I had to fight the urge to retch. Each second felt like an hour, and with every new layer of dust settling on me, I felt my panic escalate. Blood thundered in my veins. I was choking on my own adrenaline, convinced something unspeakable was about to happen. Then the voices returned. They rose from every surface, enveloping me in that guttural chant of Dissertaba, as if multiple throats echoed the words from behind the walls. My hair stood on end, and I could hardly keep my knees from buckling. My ears buzzed with static, intensifying the sense that something was drastically wrong with my reality. Through the spiraling terror, I thought of my half-written chapters, the research data scattered across my desk, the hope I once had of finishing my PhD and moving on. I realized that if I wanted to survive, if survival was even the right word, I had to write. I had to keep pushing forward, no matter how drained or terrified I felt. Scrambling to my feet, I lunged toward the desk and opened my laptop. My hand shook so violently I almost dropped the computer. I typed whatever came to mind, not even caring if it related to my dissertation, just words, phrases, any text to fill the page. Gradually, the furious chanting faded and the downpour of dust thinned, then stopped altogether. My breath returned in short, ragged bursts, but at least air moved through my lungs again. My t-shirt clung to my damp skin, the tang of salt from my sweat mixing with the stale odor of the walls. I tried to calm my trembling feeling. The last echoes of fear reverberate through my aching muscles. In the following days, I existed in a strange pact with my own living space every morning. I'd jolt awake with a racing heart, half expecting the roof to cave in. Then, forcing myself through the haze of dread and exhaustion, I'd sit down to write as my fingers danced across the keys. The building relaxed around me. The wind outside might howl, but the module's internal skeleton kept quiet. I needed to keep producing words, any words, or risk triggering that terrible conjuration of dust slams and whispers. My dissertation advanced, but at a cost. Every word I typed was marinated in anxiety. My entire body lived on. Constant alert shoulders, knotted stomach. Sour with tension, my nightmares bled into my daytime thoughts. Sometimes, even while writing, I'd sense a presence looming behind me, as if a pair of invisible eyes were reading each sentence over my shoulder. As the final weeks of the semester approached, the voices grew persistent. Their tone was no longer purely menacing. It almost sounded pleading, a twisted lament echoing in the metal panels. By now, I recognized the pattern. If I typed diligently for a few hours, they grew quiet. If I dared to stand up to walk away from my desk, the building sighed and let me go without incident, so long as I kept in mind that I would return soon. But if I abandoned the work for too long, the oppressive hush and the dust-laden countdown resumed. Eventually, I decided to call the campus facilities to at least come and inspect the structural integrity. When the inspector arrived, I felt a knot of fear coiling in my belly. The man walked through the module, lightly tapping walls and shining a flashlight at the ceiling. He said it was oddly creaky, might be some manufacturing defect, but found nothing dangerously out of code. I wanted to show him the ultrasound readings, the cracks shaped like cryptic maps, but under the harsh glare of the midday sun, the cracks looked superficial, barely noticeable. It was as if the place itself was hiding its deeper wounds to keep me trapped in uncertainty. The inspector left with a shrug and a recommendation to contact him if anything worsened. I realized I was on my own, whether this was a psychological breakdown or some bizarre synergy of my stress. With the building's flaws, no one else could truly help me. The only relief came from the discipline of writing. Perhaps that was the key all along. Finishing my dissertation meant either escaping the clutches of this phenomena or confronting it head on, so I worked with a fervor I never knew I possessed, typing until my eyes burned page by page, chapter by chapter. I neared completion late one night as I wrapped up the final paragraph of a crucial section. The module let out a sound that startled me to my core. It wasn't the usual slam or groan. It was a long, drawn-out exhalation, almost like the building itself was sighing in relief. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I felt an odd sense of calm creeping in. The dust no longer fell. The walls no longer trembled. An electric hush enveloped me, so total that I could hear my own heartbeat. I saved my document, closed my laptop, and found myself waiting for something, some final test or eruption of terror, but nothing came. The hush persisted, serene, yet strangely charged, as though the module was giving me a moment to reflect. I stood there for a long time, eyes darting from the hairline cracks to the edges of the doors. My breathing steadied. Perspiration cooled on my skin, sending a mild shiver down my spine. Then, tentative, I walked toward the exit. This time the door did not resist me. Its hinges creaked softly, but it swung open without protest. A swirl of cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of grass and distant traffic. I stepped onto the gravel outside, half expecting to hear that phrase hissed in the darkness. Nothing. The silence felt absolute, like a vacuum. I closed the door gently behind me. My entire body trembled. A mixture of terror, relief, and something close to exhilaration. I don't know what force animates that claustrophobic structure. Maybe it's just my mind battered by stress. weaving illusions out of the building's normal wear and tear, or maybe there truly is a presence within those flimsy walls, a spirit that demands productivity in exchange for peace. I have no desire to dwell on the truth. All I know is that the module remains standing quietly awaiting my return. Even now, as I recount this, my palms grow clammy and my throat constricts with the memory of those voices somewhere behind me. Out there in the darkness, I sense that fragile rectangle of metal and insulation patient as a predator. Tonight, I will allow myself a small respite tomorrow. I'll return to face my final round of revisions with each keystroke. I'll recall the synchronized slams, the drifting sawdust that measured my fear, one grain at a time, and the hush that turned my heart into a thunderclap in my own ears. I'll remember the cracks that formed cryptic maps and the ultrasound device that told me the place should have collapsed long ago, and I'll keep writing. I have to. Because the moment I decide to abandon my dissertation for good, I know exactly what awaits me on the other side of those thin, groaning walls. The next slam, the next unstoppable countdown of dust, and that haunting whisper echoing from every surface, daring me to desert a no-D Saba story. I knew something was wrong the moment I brought those portraits into my home. The air itself seemed to contract around them as if the walls were holding their breath in anticipation. They weren't particularly handsome pictures, just two faded photographs from the 1880s. The kind you might see in old historical archives. Both showed severe-looking individuals in formal attire, their gazes fixed just above the camera's lens, faces drained of any warmth. I found them at a dusty bazaar downtown, drawn by an inexplicable urge to make them mine. From the instant I laid eyes on them, my chest felt tight, and a small voice inside me insisted I leave them behind. But I ignored that instinct and brought them home anyway. I'm a creature of curiosity, always poking and prodding at the unknown. That's why the concept of these old portraits fascinated me, especially once I noticed the peculiar effect they had on the corridor in my apartment. I hung both frames on opposite walls of the corridor, expecting to forget about them in a few days. At first, nothing seemed different, but on the second night, while examining the left portrait, an austere woman in a high-collared dress, I realized the edge of the frame had become pliable, almost like thick paper you could bend without thinking. I folded a corner back and then set it flat again, but I could have sworn the corridor felt a few inches narrower. The next morning, it wasn't an optical illusion. I measured the distance between walls and discovered I had lost 5 centimeters. That was the first moment my scalp prickled with genuine dread. I told a friend about it in a casual way, hoping to shrug it off. But he only laughed at the notion. He joked that I must have miscalculated or read the numbers wrong, though his tone was light. My heart thudded heavily in my chest when I tried to measure again. The corridor truly had shrunk, as if space itself had folded under the portrait's influence, convinced that I was either going mad or that I had stumbled upon something supernatural. I decided to test the phenomenon more systematically. I made the same precise fold on the left side of the portrait that night. By dawn, I measured the gap again. It had reduced by another 5 centimeters. Something about this power fascinated me. Perhaps it was the possibility of controlling my environment in a way that defied the laws of physics. Or maybe it was simply the rush of discovering that reality could bend at the edges when manipulated just right. Every time I folded the frame, the corridor shrank a little more. If I unfolded it, everything returned to normal. By the next morning, my heart would pound whenever I handled the corners, a dull roar in my ears as I tested the boundaries of rationality. The air in my apartment felt denser, tinged with a stale scent I couldn't quite identify. My mouth turned dry whenever I looked at the woman's portrait, her eyes seeming to look past me into an uncharted dimension behind my spine. By the third week, I noticed that the second portrait, the one featuring a gaunt man with a stern mustache, exhibited the same bizarre pliability. Its right edge bent easily under my fingertips. An odd thrill ran through me. My skin prickled at the memory of how the corridor shrunk with just a mild fold. Now I had two frames to manipulate. I should have recognized the danger, but I was enthralled by the idea of controlling physical space. In such a fantastical way, I wanted to push things further to see how far I could go. It was arrogance, plain and simple, and with arrogance comes risk. Late one night, under the dim glow of a single light bulb in the corridor, I decided to create a more complex fold, something more elaborate than a simple corner crease. I zigzagged the left and right edges of the portraits, feeling the stiff material bend and crackle in my hands. My stomach was nodding with a heavy mix of excitement and alarm. The corridor felt alive, almost breathing along with the movement of my hands. I could hear faint rustling sounds in the walls as though tiny invisible creatures skittered just beneath the surface. Sweat formed on my palms, and each breath I took felt too shallow, as if the oxygen had grown stale and thin. I went to bed that night, unable to shake the feeling that I had tampered with something colossal. A force best left untouched, my dreams were incoherent bursts of twisting hallways and whispering frames. When I awoke, the entire room felt wrong, as though the angles of the ceiling didn't quite match the edges of the floor. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning with confusion. My heart thudded irregularly in my chest as I stood and opened my bedroom door where I expected to find the short corridor. I saw a corridor that seemed to bend off in multiple directions, a labyrinth of corners turning onto themselves like some nightmarish echo, painting the color drained from my face as I stepped forward. The floor warped subtly under my feet, creating the disking sense that I was walking on the inside of a giant paper sculpture. Every few steps, the hallway would split into smaller passages, some of which led to dead ends, others twisting up or down at impossible angles. My breathing turned ragged. I wiped cold sweat from my forehead. Noticing the walls themselves felt colder than usual. The overhead lighting flickered intermittently as if uncertain whether to illuminate this aberration of geometry. I had to keep one hand on the wall to steady myself. My mind balked at each impossible angle, each step threatening to topple me into dizzying confusion. My pulse hammered so insistently in my ears that I could barely hear my own unsteady footsteps. The silence was broken only by faint creaks of the shifting structure, a constant reminder that space itself had been twisted by my foolhardy experimentation after wandering through the corridor's new labyrinthine layout for what felt like hours. I noticed something in the distance, a slight glow of warm light. I followed it each step like treading on the edge of a high precipice. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself onward, determined to find some clue as to how I could undo this monstrous transformation. As I approached the glow, I recognized it as coming from the center of the corridor, where the two portraits had originally hung facing each other, but now in this twisted realm, the frame seemed to hang suspended in midair, overlapping at impossible angles that defied conventional geometry. In the center, I found a single frame standing upright like a narrow doorway. It was the woman's ornate wooden frame, but the photograph within was missing. Instead, there was an empty space rippling like liquid mercury, curious and horrified. I looked closer and realized it wasn't exactly empty. A faint outline was visible, forming into a face. My breath caught in my throat when I recognized the features. It was me, or rather a sepia-toned version of me with eyes closed. I felt a jolt of icy dread in the pit of my stomach. The sight of my own face in that antique style rattled the very foundations of my sanity. I raised a trembling hand to touch the edge of the frame, intending to remove the photograph or tear it even in my half-panicked state. I reasoned that if I destroyed the image, maybe I could break the corridor's cursed warping. The wood felt oddly soft, almost pulsing under my fingertips. Summoning what little courage I could, I tried to rip the photo from its backing the moment my fingertips pressed into the paper. I felt something pushed back from the other side. A jolt shot up my arm and I recoiled in terror. My heart pounded so violently that my chest ached determined not to be controlled by this phenomenon. I braced myself and grabbed at the photo again. This time I felt cold, bony hands curling around my wrists from inside the frame. My stomach lurched. I couldn't see these hands, only feel their grip, icy and impossibly strong. They tugged, pulling me forward. Panic flooded my body and I screamed, silently, breath catching in my throat. My heart hammered like it might burst with a desperate yank. I wrenched myself free, stumbling backward onto the warped floor. My mind reeled as I tried to process what had just happened. The corridor around me shuddered, and I realized I had to find a way out before I lost all sense of direction. My vision blurred with tears of panic. Every corridor seemed to loop back on itself in a disorienting swirl of angles. The temperature dropped with each step, and the walls seemed to press closer as if eager to trap me forever. Eventually, I noticed that if I touched certain corners of the corridor close to where the original frame should have been, I could feel the textures bend under my palm akin to the pliable frames. Gathering every ounce of composure, I began trying to unfold the walls, pressing them outward in an attempt to restore normality. The strain on my mind was immense. It felt as if I were single-handedly pushing against some cosmic force, intent on sealing me in after. An agonizing struggle, the space began to realign. I could see the passageway shrink and merge back into a single corridor. Though the angles never fully returned to normal, they seemed closer to the geometry I recognized as real. Exhausted and drenched in a cold sweat, I stumbled back into my bedroom and slammed the door shut, as though that simple act could block out the impossibility behind me. My chest heaved with every breath, my limbs trembled, and my mouth was so dry I could hardly swallow when morning finally came. I crept back into the corridor, half expecting to find it a tangled labyrinth to my relief. The corridor appeared almost as it was before, but almost is the key word. Both portraits hung on the wall as if nothing had happened, but the woman's frame was now crooked, the edges warped in unnatural shapes. And in the man's portrait, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It no longer showed the original stern gentleman from 1880. Instead, it showed me in sepia, my eyes open this time, gazing directly into the lens with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It felt as though the photograph was waiting for me to pass by so it could track my every move. I attempted to set the frames down in a closet far away from the corridor, but the very thought of touching them made me nauseous with dread. My fingertips twitched at the memory of those cold hands pulling me in an echo of that paralyzing moment. I ended up wrapping the portraits in old sheets and carefully placing them in a storage trunk. The entire time I was aware of my own breath rattling in my throat, my heart racing at the prospect of their bizarre power even covered. They seemed to emit a low hum of presence, like a faint vibration that pressed against my consciousness. Ever since that night, I hear the walls at odd hours as if the corridor were breathing softly in its sleep. Sometimes when I pass by the trunk, I imagine I can see the shape of my face pressing against the fabric from inside eyes, now wide open, trailing me with silent accusation. My sense of reality feels fractured. Every shadow on the wall raises my pulse. Each unexpected noise sends a jolt through my veins. I catch myself staring at corners, half expecting them to flex or bend. If I look away at times, I question my sanity, wondering if the entire experience was just a convoluted nightmare. But the measurements on the corridor still refuse to match their original numbers, and I can never quite shake the memory of those invisible hands, nor the weight of that twisted realm folding in on itself. I haven't dared to attempt another fold. My hands sometimes twitch with the urge like a phantom itch I can't fully dismiss. The compulsion remains flickering at the edge of my thoughts, the idea that I could, if I wanted, reshape my surroundings at will. But each time the notion arises, a chill creeps up my spine, and I recall the labyrinth and the sensation of being dragged into my own portrait. I can't risk stepping into that nightmare again. To this day, the corridor feels narrower than it once was, as though it retains permanent scars from the folds I made. The overhead light still flickers, leaving me with the nagging suspicion that the environment is never entirely stable. When I walk through that space, at night I feel eyes on me, even though the portraits remain hidden under layers of cloth. I'm certain they watch, waiting for another chance to twist my reality. I'm left with a lingering disc that taints every moment in my home. There are days when I stand there in the corridor, heart pounding against my ribs, listening for the faint rustle of something shifting. My breath comes in unsteady gasps. I remind myself that I escaped the labyrinth once before, yet the memory remains vivid, an uninvited reminder that entire dimensions can peel back like paper if tampered with in the wrong way, and although I escape, part of me remains trapped in that photograph. Eyes open wide, forever staring back. The knowledge alone is enough to make me sweat in the middle of the night, uncertain of what might happen should I ever dare to fold reality again. Story 11 and the clang of distant machinery first caught my ear as I stepped into the printing press that night, a shrill metallic echo that made my stomach clench. Something about that sound was sharper than usual, more urgent, as if the presses themselves were screaming out a warning. The overhead fluorescents flickered for an instant. I stood in near complete darkness and my heart thumped at double speed. Then the lights came back, humming insistently, revealing the rows of printing machines and towering pallets of paper, but the shadows near the back of the plant seemed to deepen as though they harbored secrets. I wasn't prepared to discover I worked the graveyard shift in a printing company nestled in a half-abandoned industrial park while most people are asleep. I'm folding, cutting, and boxing endless stacks of catalog as flyers and promotional materials I used to enjoy. The solitude convinced it, offered me room to think and dream about a better life. But over the last few weeks, that solitude has taken on a new, more sinister texture, a sense of being watched. Followed me through the aisles, peripheral shapes darted between piles of boxes always gone when I spun around, my breath would catch in my throat, my skin crawling with the unmistakable feeling of a presence, something that lurked just beyond the threshold of my vision. Those early incidents were small enough that I found reasons to dismiss them. Exhaustion, the hum of machinery playing tricks on my ears, or the way the fluorescent lighting sometimes cast weird shadows. At the time that explanation seemed sufficient, it was easier to deny the creeping dread than to face its possible reality. Besides, my boss seldom popped in after 10 p.m., so I had no one to confide in. The other overnight workers never stuck around long. We were on a rotating schedule, and the staff changed unpredictably, so I was often alone, but then the boxes began to move on their own. It started one Wednesday around 3 a.m., a time when my eyes grow heavy and every inch of my muscles aches for a break. I was checking a newly printed batch of catalogs for smudges. As I lifted my head, I noticed a neat formation of cardboard boxes had been stacked into something resembling a stairway. I remembered that I had left those boxes randomly scattered around an hour earlier. Every hair on my neck stood upright. My rational mind insisted that maybe a coworker came by and arranged them, but the part of me that felt the goosebumps said differently. It was too perfect, too purposefully angled, leading directly up to an old supply cabinet that always remained locked. Nobody had a key but management, and they never even opened it during daylight hours. I tried to ignore the shiver creeping along my spine. I went back to my work, pointedly keeping my focus on the catalogs and paper stacks. Yet from the corner of my eye, that eerie formation refused to be dismissed. When I gathered the courage to look again, my heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo off the concrete walls. The boxes looked like they had grown in number. I couldn't recall how many had been there before, but I was certain it had doubled. It was as if the plant itself was conspiring to build that bizarre staircase step by step the next few nights. The phenomenon repeated: more boxes, more elaborate angles, forming a direct path to the locked cabinet. By then I was sleeping poorly during the day, dreading the moment I'd step foot back in that cavernous building. I told myself I should mind my own business, stop checking, stop feeding the curiosity, but it gnawed at me. Every time I saw those makeshift steps, it felt like a silent invitation to peer inside the cabinet, and despite my instincts screaming otherwise, I grew fixated on the idea of seeing what was in there one night. Curiosity won. It was nearly 2:30 in the morning when I convinced myself I had to climb those boxes. My hands were clammy and my heart hammered so loudly I feared someone or something might hear it. The arrangement of boxes was surprisingly stable. Each step meticulously placed. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I ascended the fluorescent lights above me, buzzed, flickered again, casting everything into an unearthly strobe with my arms trembling. I reached the padlock on the cabinet to my shock. It fell open at a single tentative pull. My stomach twisted in immediate dread. The lock wasn't broken, but it was definitely not secured. As I swung the cabinet doors open, the stench of old paper and something like stale air wafted out inside were proofs for a catalog, the kind we produce daily, stuffed into file folders. Nothing unusual at first until I noticed the faces on those proofs. They were all employees, the daytime shift, the warehouse crew, even the sales team. I recognized them from the staff pages we sometimes print, but something was horribly wrong. Each face had been scratched out with thick red markings. My vision swam and I studied myself on the cabinet frame. Then I saw my own face. The date scrolled beneath in red ink was 2 weeks from that very night. The red slash crossing out my face seemed so violently etched that parts of the paper had torn. It felt like the air was sucked out of my lungs. My pulse pounded in my ears and a cold sweat broke across my forehead. The realization hit me like a gut punch. Whoever or whatever had done this was not playing a prank. I could feel the malevolence radiating off those pages as though they were cursed objects that had no business being in this world. My knees nearly buckled. I imagined footsteps approaching behind me, a presence close enough to whisper. I whirled around, nobody, just the silent humming darkness, panic swelling in my chest. I shoved the folder back into the cabinet and slammed the door shut with enough force to echo across the warehouse without looking back. I scrambled down the makeshift stairway. My breath was ragged, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm. But as soon as my foot touched the concrete floor, I heard a deep groan like metal, twisting under impossible pressure. The towers of boxes collapsed behind me in a thunderous crash, sending scraps of cardboard flying, and then, unbelievably, they were crushed inward as if clasped by gigantic hands that weren't there. I watched horrified as cardboard and paper folded in on itself, reduced to a flattened pile. In seconds, I fled, my lungs burned as I darted to my work, certain I could hear raspy breathing from the cabinet's direction. The next hour was a blur. I tried to refocus on printing tasks, but my eyes kept darting around, scanning for any sign that something else was moving when morning came. I practically ran out, not daring to share the story with my supervisor since that night the job has turned into a relentless torment. The next shift, I avoided the place where the cabinet stood still. I heard constant scraping sounds echoing from that corner, even though I refused to look my peripheral vision. Caught movement whenever I neared. Then around 4 a.m., I discovered neat stacks of misprinted catalogs waiting for me by the workstation. These were errors nobody had caught earlier. They were aligned in precise rows, each misprint circled in red pen. It made no sense because proofing happens electronically. Why would there be physical prints annotated in red? And who was doing it? My heart thundered as I flipped through them. I recognized the day shift manager's face in one of those misprinted pages. A thick line of red slashed across her eyes. Something not part of the original design. I wanted to show it to someone else, but I realized how insane it would sound. I think the printing press is haunted. Look at these pages nobody else printed. People would laugh it off or worse, question my mental stability, so I kept it to myself. Feeling more isolated than ever, I tried to brush it aside, but the tension grew. Night by night, each time I passed the corridor near the cabinet, I felt an oppressive weight pressing onto my shoulders, making each step harder. The hum of machinery started to feel like a chant. The overhead lights flickered more frequently, plunging me into darkness. For seconds at a time, my hands shook, sweat ran down my temples. My vision would blur unexpectedly, and I'd see shapes crawling along the walls. Sometimes I believed I heard them, breathing the sound thick and wet, like lungs struggling in the dark. One evening, I worked alongside another colleague for a few hours, a tall guy from shipping who was quiet by nature. He asked if I'd noticed strange box formations in the back. I mumbled something dismissive, but inside my nerves lit up like a fuse. He mentioned in a hushed, uneasy tone that nobody could remember stacking them that way. Instead of pressing further, he quickly changed the subject as though he regretted bringing it up. I could tell it unnerved him too, but neither of us wanted to delve too deeply. Our exchange was short, mostly hushed, an unspoken agreement that we were brushing off something too big to confront, and it wasn't just the boxes anymore. Occasionally, I'd notice the large roll-up garage door at the loading dock rattling as if someone was trying to get in or out, though no footsteps or voices followed the bathrooms located near the far end of the plant, echoed with the faint drip of faucets that upon checking weren't turned on. My reflection in the bathroom mirror under the dull fluorescence sometimes appeared contorted as if the corners of my mouth drooped too low or my eyes belonged to someone else. Goosebumps covered my arms every time I caught such distortions, and I'd blink until I saw my normal face again. All these encounters culminated in a crescendo of dread around midnight. 2 days ago, I was double checking a particularly large order of catalogues when the lights flickered off completely. My breath caught and my heart felt like it might explode. I stood there in absolute blackness, hearing only the whir of the printing machines and the frantic drumming of blood in my ears. Then in the distance, a single red emergency light kicked on, illuminating that dreaded corridor in an ominous glow through that red haze. I glimpsed the shapes of cardboard boxes once again forming a staircase. My throat constricted. I willed my legs to move to run anywhere else, but my body felt lean. An echoing sigh, heavy, suffocating, slithered across the plant. My lungs seized. It sounded close right behind me. The stench of hot breath grazed my neck. Finally, when the overhead light sputtered back to life, I found myself kneeling. Nails digging into my palms, but the corridor was empty. Not a single box was out of place. The only proof of something amiss was the scorching terror pumping through my veins. That near encounter forced me to confront the situation. I was losing my sanity by increments. Each night my mind was unraveling under the weight of half-seen apparitions, cryptic stacks of boxes, and that horrifying locked cabinet with its cursed catalogues. Started to dread the future date scribbled beneath my own photo. A creeping paranoia told me that something was going to happen. Some unspeakable event tied to that date last night. I resolved that I'd either quit or somehow face whatever lurked in that cabinet. My body felt as though it vibrated with tension. From the moment I clocked in, I did my tasks mechanically, pretending not to hear the faint scraping sounds along the walls at around 3 a.m. That same chilling sigh resonated from behind the old machines. A prickle of cold sweat slid down my spine. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to go to the corridor. My legs quivered with each step. I heard the echo of my heartbeat, rapid and insistent, in my ears. The corridor seemed elongated, as though the entire building had warped to trap me in a maze of monstrous possibilities. When I reached the cabinet, I saw it was ajar. I didn't need to climb any stairs. This time, the door was already slightly open. My pulse pounded as I placed a trembling hand on the handle. Inside, scattered among the proofs, were new pages. They depicted the next cycle of employees slated to appear in the catalogues, except now the red crosses were replaced by red circles around their eyes. My throat tightened. It felt like a threat. My face wasn't in there this time, but that date next to my photo from the previous folder seared into my mind. It was less than a week away, summoning a last shred of courage. I ripped out my page, my photo, and shoved it into my pocket. The paper felt cold, almost damp, as if it had been underwater. I wanted to tear the rest of the pages, destroy them, but the air thickened around me and fear rooted my limbs. I slammed the cabinet door shut, feeling the reverberation in my bones. Then from behind the door, that rumbling sigh reverberated again, rattling the metal in a way that made my teeth clack together. I fled, hardened my throat, not looking back. I thought about quitting on the spot, but I also felt a perverse need to prove my own sanity. Perhaps by returning one last time, confronting the unexplainable and making it out alive tonight. I came armed with an intention: gather all the cursed proofs and burn them. But the moment I entered the plant, I realized I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps that didn't align with my own, a presence that lurked behind the machinery. My breath quickened and I felt the hairs on my arms rise. I dashed to my workstation and found a brand new pile of error prints. The misalignments were circled in red just like before, but now each circle resembled an eye. The shadows lengthened around me, contorting into shapes that quivered on the edges of my vision. I heard the throbbing of my own pulse. My lips went dry and my lungs fought for air. Then I sensed the corridor behind me shift, as if it elongated into a winding, paper-strewn path. A swirl of unseen energy prickled my skin, sending a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. The overhead lamps dimmed, plunging me into a half-light reminiscent of a failing flashlight. My heart pounded so violently I thought I'd collapse, but I forced myself forward, ignoring the swirl of black shapes in my peripheral vision. Every second it felt like something was about to clamp icy fingers around my neck. Reaching the cabinet, I yanked it open inside. It was empty. No proofs, no folders, just a void, as though all those horrifying pages had never existed. My knees quacked. I could feel the oppressive weight behind me. A presence closing in my skin burned with cold sweat. A voice or a shadow of a voice whispered behind my right ear, but the words dissolved before I could make sense of them with a sudden burst of adrenaline. I spun on my heel, forced my feet to move, and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside in the loading bay under the flickering security light. My lungs heaved and my vision swam with bright spots. For several minutes, I just stood there, gulping the cold night air, waiting for my heart to slow. Eventually, I forced myself to gather my belongings, ignoring the labyrinth of crates and the sense that eyes tracked my every movement. I clocked out early, aware that I might never return. Now I'm back in my cramped apartment. Heart still pounding, a single question echoes in my mind. What happens on that date scrolled beneath my own photo? It's looming less than a week away each time I close my eyes. I see that red slash across my face. I hear that rumbling sigh. Worst of all, I can't escape the feeling that the factory is with me, its spectral weight pressing on my chest. Even now, my nights are sleepless, my days are filled with dread. I can't decide if it's paranoia or something very real reaching for me. What I do know is that those boxes, that cabinet, and those vicious red marks are still out there inside that massive humming plant, where daylight never seems to penetrate fully, and every night brand new stacks of flawless paper stand at attention, revealing mistakes that no one has caught, yet taunting the boundaries between reality and nightmare. Each misprint feels like a cautionary message from a realm I'd rather not understand, and over it all, the heavy sigh echoes an unseen presence that lingers in the corner of my vision, ready to twist cardboard into a staircase that leads to secrets best left sealed. I haven't returned to work yet, but part of me knows that no matter where I run, the sense of being marked won't vanish. The countdown in my mind continues, and the memory of those red-slashed faces is forever etched into my nightmares. Even now, when I close my eyes, I imagine stepping back into that corridor under the flickering lights, hearing the boxes scrape across the floor, and feeling the cold, invisible force that crushes them to dust. The air is thick with dread, and every step I take feels like it could be my last. I might have escaped the plant for a moment, but I haven't escaped what lurks within it, and I doubt I ever will. Story 12. I still remember the night I first spread the yellow translucent quilt over my bed. The fabric glowed faintly under the dim light of my old bedside lamp, as though it contained a trapped flame. Something about it set my teeth on edge. I caught myself staring at the shifting patterns in the fabric, half expecting them to move on their own. The entire room seemed to shrink around me. The walls too close, the air too thick. My pulse drummed in my ears, and a prickle of unease crawled down my spine. There was no reason for me to be nervous. This was just an inheritance, a so-called relic of engagement passed down in my family for years. But the way it shimmered reminded me of something alive. I grew up hearing whispers about this quilt from my grandmother. She would mention in hushed voices that it had been in our family longer than anyone cared to admit. Supposedly, it was brought over from Japan by some distant ancestor. No one used it except on rare occasions, weddings. Maybe even then I had always thought people were too superstitious, but it was mine now, and I couldn't refuse an inheritance that the rest of my relatives swore was a blessing. I told myself it was just a piece of fabric, that the stories were nonsense. Still, my skin felt clammy as I prepared for bed, the overhead bulb flickering as if to heighten the sense of foreboding. The first night I used the quilt, I dreamed of drifting through a sweet-smelling fog. My entire bedroom was awash in that scent, thick and cloying like incense that had been lit for hours. Yet when I snapped awake the next morning, 9 hours later, there wasn't a single candle or incense stick in sight. An uneasy sweat coated my face, and my chest felt tight as though I'd just experienced something more intense than any dream. The weirdest part was that I hadn't actually dreamed at all. I remembered nothing but that dense fog. My body felt oddly heavy. Then I noticed them symmetrical, hand-shaped marks on my shoulders. Each was cool to the touch, as if some intangible fingers had pressed down on me during the night. They looked like pale bruises, perfectly outlined imprints of slender digits, almost inhuman in length. The sight made me shudder. I tried to dismiss it as a bizarre reaction to new bedding, maybe an allergic rash, but something about the precision of those marks nagged at me. They were too neat, too exact in their shape. Trying to shake it off, I folded the quilt and placed it in a trunk at the foot of my bed. Then I hurried off to work the entire morning, feeling slightly unreal. My reflection in the bathroom mirror had a haunted quality, and I couldn't help noticing how. Each time I blinked, my face seemed more drawn and wary, as if a small part of me expected something to appear behind me. Later, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched online for translations of the Japanese characters I thought I had glimpsed in that swirling mist. It hadn't just been an illusion. I was certain I saw them forming in the air, faintly glowing like embers. I recognized a pattern from some old book I had once skimmed. When my quick attempts didn't provide a definitive answer, I asked a professor of East Asian studies at a local community group. He told me with a perplexed frown that the characters roughly translated to sleep for, "I heal you that only deepen my suspicion. Heal me from what there was no reason for me to need healing. At least not physically." A sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. At home, I found the quilt folded neatly on top of my pajamas. Even though I was sure I had locked it away in the trunk, my heart began pounding the moment I saw it. I felt a chill creep across my arms. The fabric was slightly damp, as though it had soaked up morning dew, and it smelled faintly of that same sweet, heady aroma. I recoiled, refusing to touch it, yet it stayed there as if beckoning me with its translucent shimmer. I tried to ignore it, to leave my bedroom and distract myself, but something about its presence was too overwhelming. Eventually, I caved, and with trembling hands stuffed it back into the trunk. That night, I slept without it, or I tried to. Insomnia battered me until dawn. Every time I closed my eyes, I sensed a presence close by, hovering at the edge of the darkness. I struggled with this pattern for days. Insomnia whenever I refused to use the quilt, and dreamless 9-hour slumbers when I let it envelop me. Each time I awakened, I found identical handprints on my shoulders. Their positions varied slightly, but the shape was always unnatural, slender and cool worse. I began to experience a creeping paranoia. During my waking hours, the house felt different. The wooden floors groaned more than usual, the pipes hissed in the walls, sounding eerily like breath. Even the shadows cast by the furniture seemed to shift whenever I turned my back. There were moments when I thought I saw a silhouette, tall and distorted, vanish into the corners of the room. My heart would hammer wildly in my chest, my vision swimming as adrenaline surged. My breath came in ragged gasps, and cold sweat trickled down my spine. In a moment of desperation, I approached the professor again. I mentioned my family's story about this so-called relic of engagement, carefully avoiding direct specifics that might sound too unhinged. He assured me that certain cultural artifacts were said to offer spiritual protection, but none that he knew of involved leaving physical marks. He added that some legends spoke of protective spirits or entities that watch over sleepers, sometimes at a cost. The cost in my case seemed to be a gnawing fear that grew stronger with each night of forced rest. I stopped talking about it to anyone else. My coworkers noticed I had grown pale and jumpy, but they couldn't pry out more than a non-committal grunt. I was aware that I might sound delusional if I tried to explain, "Oh, it's just my haunted quilt that's giving me dreamless nights and ghostly handprints." I couldn't bring myself to utter those words aloud. Instead, I kept my head down, did my job, and came home each evening to face the same choice attempt: a normal sleep and be tortured by insomnia, or let the quilt have its way. Eventually, I gave in to the quilt more nights than not. Just to survive the work week, each morning the pattern repeated symmetrical marks, a faint residue of sweet incense in the air, and my body feeling unnaturally heavy yet oddly refreshed. It was a paradoxical sensation, physically rested but mentally on edge, like my mind was alert, but my emotions were fraying, and then the hallucinations or whatever they were grew stronger. I began to see fleeting wisps of that same smoky vapor curling out from beneath my closet door, or twisting around the corners of the mirror in the bathroom. One evening I snapped and decided I had to break the cycle for good. I grabbed the quilt, its texture clammy and unnervingly soft, and shoved it into a plastic bag. My heart pounded in my throat and my fingers trembled as I taped the bag shut. Then I headed to the back of the house where an old storage shed stood. The place smelled of dust and rotten wood. My breath sounded too loud. In the stillness, I buried the quilt under stacks of boxes. By the time I finished, the muscles in my arms quivered. I left the shed, locked it firmly, and hurried to bed, refusing even to glance in the direction of those boxes. This time, I forced myself to remain under my normal blanket, trying to quell the rising panic in my chest. I slept fitfully, my mind swirling with half-formed nightmares. At around 3 in the morning, I jolted upright, a wave of cold sweat drenching my forehead. I was convinced I heard something scraping outside my bedroom door. My heart hammered against my rib cage. I strained to listen. The faint scuttling noise might have been the wind or a stray branch, but it set my nerves on edge like nails on a chalkboard. Every shadow in the room looked like it was leaning toward me, hungry for my fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, I drifted into an uneasy doze. When the alarm blared at 7, I awoke to the same stifling smell of incense. My nostrils flared and dread crashed over me. I stared at my trunk, half expecting to see the quilt draped on top, but there was no sign of it for a moment. Relief fought my anxiety. Maybe it was still locked away. I stumbled to the bathroom, my limbs shaky with exhaustion, and they're folded neatly on the counter. Next to my toothbrush was the quilt. It looked damp and cold, droplets of condensation clinging to the translucent yellow fabric. My throat tightened and I tasted bitter fear at the back of my tongue. It was as if the quilt was telling me it could not be hidden. My rational mind fought to find an explanation, but reason didn't hold up against the sight of that impossible object. I couldn't wrap my head around how it had moved on its own. My stomach churned and I could hear my heart thunder in my ears. The sense of being trapped, of having no choice but to submit to this bizarre possession, nearly made me collapse. I picked the quilt up with trembling hands, every fiber of my being wanting to hurl it away, yet terrified of provoking whatever. Presence lurked within my breathing, came fast and shallow, and I had to brace myself against the bathroom sink to keep from sliding to the floor. That evening, I found myself laying the quilt over my bed again. The mental exhaustion had beaten me into surrender. I was desperate for sleep as soon as I drew the quilt over my chest. A wave of warmth enveloped me, mingled with a heavy sweetness that clung to my lungs. My eyelids grew heavy and my thoughts blurred. It wasn't restful. It felt like being pulled under by a tranquil but powerful current. This time, my senses lingered in a place between consciousness and dream. I felt something pressing against my shoulders, slender shapes that seemed to grow out of the air itself, guiding me deeper into slumber. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I couldn't move a muscle to resist. Then the darkness swallowed me whole. I awoke exactly 9 hours later, feeling physically revitalized but emotionally hollow. The routine marks graced my shoulders stark against my skin. My fingertips tingled with pins and needles. My head pounded and each breath trembled in my chest. A suspicion kept surfacing in my mind. Perhaps this quilt was siphoning something from me, exchanging it for a dreamless coma. I wondered if it was feeding off my psyche, leaving behind an ever-growing sense of paranoia and dread. My environment turned sinister even in broad daylight. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the overhead lights sent my nerves into a frenzy. Shadows seemed to warp around corners as I passed once. As I was scrubbing dishes, I caught a reflection in the kitchen window. My own face was in focus, but over my shoulder a shape loomed too tall, too elongated, with arms that drooped unnaturally. I spun around, heart thundering, only to find the kitchen empty. My breathing came in ragged bursts and cold sweat soaked my shirt. The feeling of being observed intensified. It was as if something was always behind me. Vanishing the second I turned at work, my concentration deteriorated. I kept thinking I saw flickers of movement in the corner of my eye or wafts of that cloying smoke curling under doors. My coworkers would ask if I was all right, and I would force a laugh, telling them it was just stress or seasonal allergies. But I couldn't shake the clammy sensation of invisible hands gripping my shoulders. Even in the daytime, I felt I was teetering on the edge of a psychological break when I finally mustered the courage to confront the quilt. Directly, I carefully spread it out on the floor and examined it by the light of a single lamp. The fibers were so thin that they resembled filaments of spider silk. Looking closer, I noticed faint symbols woven into the threads, intricate lines that resembled the Japanese characters the professor had identified. My chest tightened and my breath stuck in my throat. There was an otherworldly artistry in how they interlocked, forming shapes that made me dizzy to look at it. It was as if the pattern extended into multiple dimensions. My heart pounded so violently I could feel it echo in my temples. I remembered the professor's comment about protective spirits. Perhaps Dorma was some twisted vow of guardianship. Was this thing trying to heal me or trap me? My paranoia surged. I sensed a presence behind me. My back felt cold. The hairs on my arm stood on end. I froze, every muscle tensing. Convinced I could hear a faint breath behind my left ear. When I spun around, nothing was there. My vision blurred from the adrenaline. The world felt unsteady under my feet. In that moment, I decided I wouldn't let it consume me. I resolved to return the quilt to my family's old chest in the attic. If it still reappeared afterward, I would burn it. Even though I dreaded the thought of lighting those eerie fibers on fire, I gathered my courage and started up the creaking attic stairs, each step echoing ominously in the empty house. Every squeak of the wood made my mouth go dry and my heartbeat thudded in my ears. The attic was dim, the single bulb casting erratic shadows over ancient crates and trunks. Dust motes swirled in the stale air. My palms were slick with sweat as I approached an ornate wooden trunk that had belonged to my great-grandparents. Opening it revealed a labyrinth of old linens and musty keepsakes. I placed the quilt carefully inside my hands, trembled a mixture of fear and fleeting hope that maybe this would be the end. The trunk lid came down with a dull thump, then silence. My breath caught in my throat and a crushing tension squeezed my chest. I swore I heard a faint hiss like the exhalation of some hidden presence, but I pressed the trunk firmly shut and turned away. I descended the attic stairs with shaky legs, bracing myself against the wall. The house was too quiet, too still. Every second felt elongated, like time had stretched to an unbearable limit. I found the bedroom empty and the bed bare. My shoulders felt almost weightless. Without the quilt's usual presence, a ghostly ache remained where the handprints had been, and a persistent chill trailed across my skin. I forced myself to wash my face, trying to quell the dread swirling in my stomach. When I glanced into the mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement behind the shower curtain, a shifting shadow that vanished when I whipped my head around my chest, tightened again, but I tried to ignore it. I tried to believe that it was just my rattled nerves, that I was seeing shapes where there were none. That night I braced myself for insomnia. The absence of that uncanny heaviness was as unsettling as its presence had been. I laid awake, listening for any creak or whisper that might signal the quilt's return. My ears strained against the silence, picking up the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft sigh of air through the vents. Hours passed, and I waited, heart-pounding, certain that at any moment I would see that translucent yellow shimmer in the doorway, but it never came. Eventually, exhaustion took me, and I sank into a restless sleep. Morning light brought cautious relief. I checked every inch of the house. The quilt was nowhere to be found. Slowly, as the days passed, the stifling incense odor faded. I stopped seeing flickers of movement in my peripheral vision. My coworkers remarked I looked more energetic. My breath came easier, and the tension in my shoulders began to loosen. I wondered if the quilt had simply accepted its entombment in the attic trunk, or if it was biding its time. But each sunrise eroded my fear a little more. Weeks have gone by and the house is silent again. No more phantom handprints or swirling letters in the darkness. Sometimes, though, in the middle of the night, I awaken suddenly with the distinct feeling of being watched. My heart races and perspiration beads at my temples. I lie there staring at the ceiling, imagining that sweet smell creeping under the door on those nights I remember the words the professor translated, "Sleep for I heal you." And I wonder what new nightmares might stir if I ever lifted that trunk lid again. I have not dared to open it. Even now, as I stand at the bottom of the attic ladder, I feel a chill across my shoulders. Some nights I think I hear a soft rustling overhead, the faintest whisper of fabric sliding against wood. But I keep the attic door closed and I've convinced myself it's just the old house settling. I'll cling to that explanation because the alternative that the quilt could reappear at any moment demanding to be used is too unsettling to bear. Yet in the back of my mind, I know that I've experienced something beyond explanation or logic, something that rearranged my sense of reality no matter how hard I try to forget. A tiny pulse of dread beats within me like a second heart. It reminds me that the supernatural is more tenacious than any lock and key, and that some inheritances are better left untouched. The memory of that translucent yellow shimmer, the unearthly comfort of dreamless sleep, and those impossibly long fingers leaving their mark on my skin. They weigh on me every evening. I say a silent prayer that the quilt remains hidden in darkness, but I can't deny the lingering question if it truly healed me. Then from what and at what price did it save me? I continue on haunted but free for now, each breath a testament to the fragile barrier between the world we know and the world we refuse to see, and in that space suspended between relief and dread, I wait for whatever comes next story. Music 13. The Watchers on the Mountain. The cold finds ways to penetrate even the best winter gear. This is the first truth of mountain climbing that no equipment manual will emphasize enough. The second truth, one I discovered on Mount Blackwood last winter, is that some mountains don't want to be climbed. Some mountains watch and wait. I had been planning the solo ascent of Blackwood for months, meticulously studying topographical maps and weather patterns, training my body for the arduous journey ahead. What I hadn't accounted for were the local legends 3 days before my departure while gathering final supplies in the small town of Ravenrest that nestled at the mountain's base. I overheard hushed conversations at the general store. The elderly shopkeeper warned me with grave seriousness about the watchers on the mountain, his weathered face creasing with genuine concern as he described hikers who returned, changed if they returned at all. I dismissed his warnings as small-town superstition mountains. Don't choose who climbs them, I reasoned they are geological formations, indifferent to human ambition. Science, not folklore, would guide my journey. The initial ascent was uneventful. The crisp winter air filled my lungs as I methodically made my way up well-marked trails, occasionally stopping to check my GPS coordinates against my map. The sun glinted off patches of snow, and the silence was punctuated only by the crunch of my boots and the rhythmic puffs of my visible breath. By midday, I had made excellent progress, my confidence growing with each step higher. The first hint that something was amiss came when I noticed the birds had gone silent one moment. The sparse winter forest echoed with occasional chirps and calls. The next, absolute stillness descended. I paused, adjusting my pack while scanning the treeine. That's when I first felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched. My skin prickled beneath layers of thermal clothing, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood rigid. I pivoted slowly, studying the terrain behind me, but saw nothing unusual. Just the winding path I had traveled and endless trees standing sentinel. I continued climbing, attempting to rationalize the feeling. Wilderness solitude often plays tricks on the mind. Hypervigilance is a natural evolutionary response to isolation. Yet the sensation persisted, intensifying as the afternoon progressed. The temperature began dropping more rapidly than forecast, and shadows stretched longer than they should have for that time of day. At approximately 2:30 p.m., I reached a small plateau that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. I was roughly halfway up Blackwood. Making good time despite the growing unease in my gut, I decided to take a short break, hydrate and check my bearings. That's when the fog rolled in. It didn't gather gradually as mountain fog typically does. There was no slow misting, no gentle accumulation of moisture in the air. One minute I stood in crystalline winter clarity, the next I was enveloped in a wall of dense bone-white vapor. It moved against the wind, against physics itself, swallowing the landscape with unnatural speed and purpose. My visibility plummeted to less than 10 feet. The sudden blindness triggered an immediate surge of adrenaline. My heartbeat accelerated, my breathing became shallow and quick. I fumbled for my compass only to find the needle spinning erratically. Unable to locate north, my GPS device displayed coordinates that kept shifting as if I were moving. When I stood perfectly still, I called out, my voice immediately muffled by the thick fog, the sound dying mere feet from my lips. The mountains seemed to absorb my words rather than echo them back. Rationality dictated I should wait for the fog to pass or descend to a lower elevation. I took 3 steps toward what I believed was the path down when I saw them. At first, they were merely suggestions of movement within the whiteness, vertical disturbances in the fog's uniformity, but as my eyes strained to make sense of the shapes they gained, definition impossibly tall. Unnaturally thin silhouettes moved with fluid grace between the trees. They appeared humanoid, but stretched as if someone had taken a human form and pulled it like taffy toward the sky. Their limbs bent at angles that defied anatomical possibility. I froze mid-step, primal. Fear seizing my muscles, the figures I counted 5, then 7, then more. As my eyes adjusted to the fog's deception, maintained their distance. Circling slowly, they never approached directly, never revealed themselves fully. Just patient movements coordinated like a hunting pack. The silence was absolute until it wasn't. The whispers began so subtly I initially mistook them for the wind, but wind doesn't form. Words doesn't carry conversations in languages that sound almost familiar but remain incomprehensible. The whispers seem to emanate from the fog itself rather than from the figures, as if the mist were their voice, collective, ancient, and hungry. I couldn't understand the words, yet their meaning seeped into my consciousness like cold water through fabric. They spoke of watching, of waiting, of the arrogance of men who believe mountains exist to be conquered. They spoke of others who had come before me who had been deemed worthy or unworthy. They spoke of tests and judgments and consequences. My mouth went desert dry, sweat froze against my skin. Despite my thermal layers, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Hallucinations from altitude sickness, perhaps, or oxygen deprivation affecting my brain. But my altitude reader showed only 7,200 feet. Nowhere near high enough for such severe symptoms, I remained motionless, unsure which direction offered safety. The figures continued their circular movement, neither approaching nor retreating. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we maintained this bizarre standoff. Then I felt it a touch so cold it burned through my insulated jacket, long, impossibly thin fingers pressed against my upper back. The sensation like icicles threading between my vertebrae. I couldn't turn around. Some deep instinct warned that looking directly at whatever stood behind me would be catastrophic. The pressure increased gently but insistently, pushing me forward, guiding me toward a narrow gap between 2 ancient pines. I hadn't noticed before, against every rational impulse. I followed the silent direction. The hand, if that's what it was, remained firmly planted between my shoulder blades as I stumbled forward. The whispers intensified, acquiring a rhythmic cadence that matched my footsteps. The fog parted slightly. Along the path, I was being guided, offering just enough visibility to avoid obstacles. We traveled like this for what my watch claimed was 40 minutes, but felt like days. The pressure occasionally adjusted, steering me around unseen hazards or correcting my course. I noticed the ground beneath my feet had changed no longer. The established trail, but virgin snow covering jagged rocks and twisted roots. We were moving away from any marked route into territory no topographical map had documented. Eventually, we reached a small clearing dominated by a formation of three towering stones arranged in a rough triangle. Each stone bore markings, not carvings made by human tools, but deep grooves that resembled language mathematical equations, or perhaps star charts. They seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, reorganizing into new patterns when directly observed. The pressure on my back ceased, the fog thinned just enough to reveal I was alone in the clearing. The figures had withdrawn to the perimeter, still visible as distortions rather than solid forms. The whispers converged, focusing into a single voice that spoke directly into my mind. It asked why I had come to the mountain. I found myself answering truthfully, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I explained my lifelong fascination with climbing the personal challenge, the desire to test my limits against nature's indifferent power. As I spoke, I realized how hollow my motivation sounded, how fundamentally I had misunderstood what Blackwood represented. The voice seemed to consider my response. The fog swirled around the stone formation patterns, emerging and dissolving like smoke signals. Then the voice spoke again, explaining that the mountain was not a challenge to be overcome, but a threshold to be respected. It had stood as guardian long before humans evolved, would remain long after we disappeared. Some places in the world serve as boundaries between realms, and those who cross without invitation or understanding risk more than their physical safety. I asked, voice trembling, if I was in danger. The response was neither comforting nor threatening, simply a statement that I was being evaluated as all who ventured this far were evaluated. The temperature plummeted further, frost formed on my eyelashes, my exposed skin burning with cold. The three stones began to emit a low humming that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. The fog condensed, becoming almost solid around me, pressing against my body like a mold. Taking an impression, I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. As the pressure increased, then as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog withdrew. Not gradually, but instantaneously, pulling back like a tide obeying some cosmic force. The clearing, the stones, the whispering entities all vanished. I found myself standing on the marked trail again in exactly the spot where I had stopped to rest before the fog appeared. My watch showed only 10 minutes had passed since I had checked it. Last, I stood disoriented, my mind struggling to process what had happened. Had I experienced an elaborate hallucination, a waking dream triggered by altitude and isolation? The rational part of my brain grasped for explanations involving weather phenomena, psychological stress, or previously undiagnosed medical conditions. But my body knew the truth. My back still burned with cold where the fingers had guided me. My ears still rang with whispers in that almost familiar tongue. And when I removed my pack to check for damage, I found three symbols pressed into the material. Identical to markings I had seen on the stones, I abandoned my summit attempt and descended with unprecedented speed, nearly running down the mountain as darkness approached the town. Welcomed me back with the indifference of a place accustomed to tourists. Only the old shopkeepers studied me with knowing eyes. Nodding slowly as I purchased a bus ticket out of Ravenrest the following morning, that was 6 months ago, I haven't climbed since my gear remains packed away. The backpack with its inexplicable markings locked in a storage unit. I can't bring myself to visit. I've consulted neurologists, psychologists, even meteorological experts. Anyone who might offer a scientific explanation for what happened on Blackwood. Their theories sound hollow, manufactured to comfort rather than illuminate, because the truth is I brought something back from that mountain, not a physical entity, but a persistent awareness. The sensation of being watched never leaves me. Now I feel it when I'm alone in my apartment, when I'm surrounded by crowds, even in my most private moments. Sometimes in the corner of my eye, I glimpse impossibly tall, thin silhouettes. When the wind blows a certain way, I hear whispers in that almost familiar language. And on nights when fog descends on the city, I close all my blinds and huddle under blankets because I know with absolute certainty they're still evaluating me. Still deciding the test that began on Blackwood isn't over. Perhaps it never will be. The third truth of mountain climbing. The one no guide will ever tell you sometimes. When you climb a mountain, the mountain climbs inside you and it never comes back down.